The whisper of the island. Long before the clamor of ships and the clang of forges, Manhattan breathed in silence. It was not yet New York, only an island of trees, rivers, and sacred winds. The Lenape people called it home, not by conquest, but by kinship with the land. I remember my first encounter with the stories of their presence. A weathered journal, bound in bark and twine, was handed to me by an old historian who spoke softly, as if the wind might overhear. The Lenape believed every tree had a spirit, every stream a memory. They moved through the forest with reverence, not in fear, but in recognition. The island spoke to them in rustling leaves, in the calls of birds at dusk. They did not build walls, they traced the rhythms of the earth with their footsteps. And there, in a clearing soaked in morning light, a circle of elders once sang to the sun. They wore robes dyed in ochre and red, their voices rising like mist. It was not ritual, it was memory given form. The path of shells. I remember the mornings when the forest floor glistened with dew, and the Lenape children would race along what we called the path of shells. It was a narrow trail carved gently through the woods, where crushed white clam shells, carried from the riverbanks, marked the way like a sacred thread. This path did not simply lead through the forest, it led into the heart of their lives. It passed beneath towering oaks where elders taught the old stories, and it wove between maple trees where sap was gathered like offerings to the land. As I walked that path for the first time, I realized I was treading on generations of memory, soft yet unyielding, and though I was an outsider, I was being quietly welcomed into something ancient. Fire circle at twilight. There was a sacred hush that settled over the clearing each evening when the fire was lit. The Lenape fire circle was not merely a place of warmth, it was the heart of their spoken memory. Around its flickering light, voices rose like smoke, elders reciting creation stories, hunters recounting omens in the flight of birds, mothers humming lullabies older than stone. The flames reflected in every pair of eyes, young and old, as if each face bore a piece of the tribe's spirit. I sat quietly at the edge once, an outsider given space, and felt something ancient stir in the rhythm of drum beats that pulsed through the soil itself. This was not storytelling, this was remembering. The sacred fire. The Lenape did not build temples of stone or carve monuments of grandeur. Their sanctuaries were not walled nor paved with marble. Instead, their holiest place was the fire that burned at the heart of every gathering, a quiet, breathing flame that connected the people to all that came before and all that would come after. In the center of each village stood the fire circle, its stones darkened with the soot of 1,000 nights. The elders tended it with reverence, feeding it not only with dry wood but with prayer. Tobacco leaves, dried sweetgrass, or cedar were placed gently into the flames, each offering rising in a spiral of smoke to the watching sky. The fire was never allowed to die. It was said that as long as it burned, so too would the spirit of the Lenape endure. I remember an evening when I was allowed to sit with them. The sun had long disappeared behind the hills, and the stars had emerged like ancient witnesses. Around the sacred fire, silence reigned, broken only by the soft crackle of embers. Across the circle sat a woman named Woolowitzik, her eyes reflecting the glow of the flames. She was a storyteller, not by title, but by nature. She spoke of the thunder beings who guarded the mountains and of the turtle that held the world on its back. She spoke not to entertain, but to remind. With every word the fire responded, flaring, pulsing, dimming, as if it too remembered. The children leaned in, wide-eyed, as the stars wheeled above them, silent and eternal. To witness that moment was to feel time melt away. There was no past, no future, only the fire and the breathing of those who listened. I would come to realize that this, too, was history, not ink on parchment, but memory passed in firelight. The gnawing of the river. Long before the Dutch called it the Hudson, before charts and compasses etched its name into European memory, the river had a soul. The Lenape called it Muhicantuck, the river that flows both ways. A name not just of direction, but of reverence, capturing the mysterious tide that seemed to carry the breath of the sea deep into the forested heart of the land. To them, the river was more than water. It was a living presence, a spirit that fed the people with fish and shellfish, cleansed the air with its breezes, and told the stories of the land through its murmur. Children learned to read its changes the way one might read a poem, the sharp scent of salt that signaled the turning tide, the curl of fog that meant rain, the shimmering schools of fish that danced just beneath the surface. The banks of the Muhicantuck were lined with life. Deer would come down to drink at dusk, their hooves leaving soft marks in the mud. Herons stood still as carved stone, waiting for the flicker of movement. Along its shallows, Lenape canoes moved like shadows, their paddlers knowing every current and eddy like the lines on their palms. I once asked a young boy, no older than 10, what the river meant to him. He didn't answer with words, but cupped water in his hands and let it slip through his fingers. "It knows where it goes," he said finally, "and so do we if we listen." That night I sat by the river's edge as the moon rose behind the black outline of trees. The tide turned silently, retreating as it had for thousands of years. Somewhere upriver, a loon called. The river spoke, and though I could not always understand its language, I felt its memory wash over me, old, deep, forgiving. The longhouse, heart of the people. The longhouse was more than a dwelling, it was a symbol, a vessel that held the breath and rhythm of Lenape life. Built from bent saplings, bark, and time-honored knowledge passed down through generations, it stood not merely as shelter but as a living archive of kinship, memory, and sacred continuity. From the outside, its curved shape resembled the back of a great turtle, the same turtle that, in Lenape creation stories, carried the world on its back. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and drying herbs. Fire pits burned in the center, their embers casting flickering shadows on the smooth bark walls. Families slept on raised platforms along the sides, wrapped in furs, while elders told stories that stitched together the past and future. Each story was a thread, and the longhouse was the loom upon which the fabric of identity was woven. The longhouse taught unity. Within it lived multiple generations, grandparents, parents, children, all under one roof. Disputes were settled here, not with raised voices but with listening ears and calm words. Wisdom wasn't imposed, it was shared, shaped slowly like the firestones at the center of the room. And yet there was more than domestic warmth. The longhouse also echoed with ceremony. Here the women gathered during the moon of renewal, here the boys sat in silent vigil before their first hunts, and here the spirits of the ancestors were honored with smoke and song. The walls held not just warmth, but memory, each groove in the bark a silent witness to births, deaths, and the pulse of daily life. One evening I was invited to sit beside a grandmother as she braided sweetgrass and hummed to a rhythm I could not name. "We don't live in the longhouse," she said with a smile. "We live as the longhouse." I understood then, the longhouse was not a thing, it was a way. The sacred circle and the medicine wheel. Before the day's first light touched the canopy of Mannahatta, a quiet stirring would awaken the forest clearing, not from beasts or birds, but from people in reverent motion. There, in a wide open space encircled by stones and smoothed earth, the Lenape gathered to honor the sacred circle, a concept far older than time, symbolizing the eternal cycles of life, death, and rebirth. The sacred circle was both philosophy and practice. It taught that all beings, animal, plant, human, and spirit, were interconnected, equal threads in the great web of life. At its heart lay the medicine wheel, a circular design drawn into the earth, divided into 4 quadrants: north, south, east, and west. Each direction held a color, a season, an element, and a wisdom. The east welcomed beginnings and spring's promise. The south offered growth and summer's warmth. The west brought reflection and autumn's descent, and the north stood as the keeper of wisdom, the stillness of winter. I stood quietly beside the elders as they performed the morning smoke ceremony. Sweetgrass was lit and fanned gently in all 4 directions, its fragrant tendrils rising like prayers. A child approached the center of the wheel, holding a feather and a stone. The elders spoke softly. "This is your path. You walk it with care, not just for yourself, but for the 7 generations to come." The circle was a place of healing. Here disputes found resolution, names were given, and new life was welcomed with ceremony. It was also where farewells were spoken. When a loved one passed, their spirit was guided around the wheel one final time, so they would not be lost on their journey beyond. What moved me most was the stillness. Not silence, but the kind of stillness that speaks louder than any voice, a stillness that holds the weight of understanding. It was in that sacred space that I began to grasp the deep harmony the Lenape carried in their souls, a way of life measured not in possessions or power, but in balance, humility, and reverence for the unseen. Whispers beneath the pines. There was a place deep within the forest where the pines grew tall and unbroken, their trunks rising like solemn columns in a cathedral of earth and air. The Lenape called it Wunnelhattak, the whispering place. No paths led there. You had to know its silence to find it, and once inside, the wind itself seemed to hush, as though even the spirits paused to listen. I was led there by a boy no older than 10, his eyes wide with the kind of knowledge born not from books, but from bone and breath. He said nothing as we walked. The only sounds were the brittle crunch of needles underfoot and the slow, rhythmic sighing of branches overhead. When we reached the heart of the grove, he gestured for me to sit, then turned and vanished, as if absorbed into the very fabric of the land. I sat alone beneath those towering pines, and in time I began to hear what the Lenape must have always known: the forest speaks. Not in words, but in a language older than any we have dared to write. The creak of bark, the murmur of roots, the soft rustle of a squirrel's passage, each sound was part of a conversation that had never stopped, only waited for me to listen. The elders said the whispering place was where visions came, not the grand revelations of prophets or kings, but the quiet truths that shape a soul. There, beneath the ageless canopy, I felt what it meant to belong not to a nation or name, but to the breathing world itself. When I returned, no one asked what I'd seen. They knew. The forest had given me something sacred, not knowledge but presence, and I have carried its hush within me ever since. The storyteller's fire. On a night when the wind howled through the trees like the cry of ancient spirits, I was invited to sit beside the oldest fire I had ever seen. It was not large or fierce, but steady and low, its coals glowing like the memory of suns long past. Around it sat a circle of Lenape, their faces etched by both the flickering flames and the years they had lived beneath them. At the center was the storyteller, an elder named Tamaqua, whose voice was like the slow current of a river, deep, patient, and filled with undertows. He spoke in the Lenape tongue, and though I understood little of the language, the cadence alone was enough to draw me in. His hands danced in the air, painting scenes I could see without eyes. He told of Sky Woman and Turtle Island, of how the land itself had risen from the water to cradle a people who respected its breath. He spoke of the harmony that once existed between man, beast, and spirit, of how time moved not in a line but in circles, seasons, moons, lifetimes returning upon themselves like the ring of smoke rising into the starlit night. The children sat still, their eyes wide, as if hearing the stories for the first time, though they had surely heard them many times before. And I, too, felt as though I had stumbled into a truth that had waited centuries for my presence. It was not simply the tale that moved me, but the act of telling, the fire, the faces, the silence between words. Tamaqua paused once to look at me, his gaze neither warm nor cold, but knowing. He said something I will never forget, in quiet, careful English. "When you forget stories, the land forgets you." And suddenly I understood. This was not just a people, it was a memory carried in firelight, in breath, in voice, and if we do not listen, it will not be the Lenape who are lost, it will be us. The circle of women. It was in the soft light of morning, filtered through smoke and dew, that I first came to understand the quiet strength of Lenape women. While men often took to the forest or the river, it was the women who held the village together, not as overseers, but as earth itself holds the roots of every living thing. I was led by a young girl, no older than 12, into the heart of a grove where several women worked with serene concentration. Some bent over stretched hides, tanning them with a paste of brains and smoke. Others ground corn between stones, the rhythm of their work forming a low song, as ancient and steady as heartbeat. Elder women braided corn husks into sleeping mats, their fingers quick, their voices low and warm, discussing dreams, ancestors, and the weather in the way only those closest to the land could do. At the center of this gentle hive sat the oldest of them, Wasi, known simply as grandmother. Her hair, the color of new snow, was braided and wrapped in red thread, and her eyes seemed to hold not just years, but seasons, generations. When she spoke, the others listened with stillness, as if even the wind dared not interrupt her words. She told me something I still hear, even now. To carry life is to carry memory. Men go to the forest to forget, women stay to remember. There was no bitterness in her tone, only truth, balanced and clear. She showed me a small bundle wrapped in deerskin. Inside were dried herbs, a string of shells, and a feather blackened with smoke. For birth, she said, placing it in the hands of a younger woman beside her. And with that, a life would begin, not in shouts, but in ceremony, in knowing. Here the women were not only gatherers of food, but gatherers of spirit. They made not only meals, but meaning. It was they who kept the names of the dead, who guided the dreams of the young, and who watched the stars for signs long before white men ever arrived with their maps and measurements. I left the grove in silence, feeling something shift within me, not out of guilt, but out of awe. In the West, we so often honor power by the sword, by conquest, but here, I saw it carried in the bowl, in the braid, in the hand resting lightly on a child's back. The path of the spirits. The forest on Mannahatta was more than trees. It was a living map of memory, where every trail held the imprint of footsteps long vanished. One path in particular, the elders called it Wenchi Sipu, or Spirit Way, curved like a river through dense woods, narrow and overgrown, but worn smooth by centuries of quiet procession. I followed this path one misty afternoon, guided by a Lenape boy named Nuksak, whose name meant ash tree. Though barely into manhood, his eyes were deep-set with a calm that made him seem far older than his years. He didn't speak much, but motioned with a subtle grace, every movement part of a ritual too old for words. Along the path, small stone piles, offerings lined the way. Some held feathers, others bones or shells, each a whisper to the unseen. Nuksak stopped at a mound where sweetgrass had been laid. Here, he said softly, a woman left her sorrow. He bent and lit a small bundle of dried herbs. The smoke spiraled upward, vanishing into the canopy. When someone dies, he continued, we don't cry out loud, we walk, we remember, we let the trees carry our grief. He handed me a length of black cord with a single white bead at its center. For your memory, he said, you don't have to be Lenape to carry what matters. Further down, the path narrowed into a tunnel of branches. In the hush of twilight, we passed beneath two large oak trees, their trunks twisted together like dancers. Nuksak touched one gently. This is where the old stories begin, he said. When we are ready, we come here to ask, not for answers, but to remember what we already know. As we turned to leave, I looked back once more. The forest no longer seemed quiet, it breathed, it held things, and deep within its roots, the Lenape had left more than footsteps, they had planted their souls. Whispers in the smoke. It was late autumn when I was invited to witness a smoke ceremony deep within the heart of the Lenape village, just as the final crimson leaves clung to the branches and the first frost silvered the ground. That morning the air was heavy with stillness, as if the land itself was holding its breath. A circle of stones had been cleared beneath an open sky, surrounded by bundles of dried sage, sweetgrass, and cedarwood. A small fire had already been kindled, its smoke rising in lazy, deliberate spirals. I sat among them, a quiet observer. The elder who led the rite was a woman named Witchen, which meant she who listens to the winds. Her presence was steady, her hair bound with woven cord, her voice soft and rhythmic like river water against stone. She knelt beside the fire, added herbs, and began to chant in a low tone that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. Each word was not just spoken, it was sung, and it carried a resonance that made the skin on my arms tighten, as if the forest leaned in to hear her. The smoke grew thicker, curling and dancing, wrapping around our forms like a living spirit. Witchen spoke of the ancestors who walked alongside us, invisible but never absent. They wait, she whispered, in the leaves, in the flame, in the breath between thoughts. They come when we remember. The villagers each stepped forward one by one, passing their hands through the smoke. Some wept, some murmured prayers. One man knelt for so long in silence I thought he had fallen asleep, until I saw the tears glistening on his cheeks. A child passed me a small bundle of burning cedar wrapped in corn husk. For your memory, she said, echoing words I had heard before. That day I didn't ask questions, I didn't take notes, I simply breathed, and as the smoke rose toward the sky I felt it carry more than scent. It lifted grief, gratitude, and longing. I realized then that to the Lenape, smoke was not just the remnant of fire. It was a bridge between what is gone and what remains. The path of shells. I remember walking with a young Lenape boy named Tamaqua along a narrow forest trail, damp with morning dew. He was perhaps no older than 10, but his eyes held the calmness of someone who had already watched the seasons change many times. Strung around his neck was a strand of white and purple shell beads, wampum, he called it. With his small fingers, he touched each bead as if counting something older than numbers. This path, he said, is not just made of dirt, it's made of stories. Our ancestors walked it before we were born. The trail curved gently, winding through tall oaks and ancient chestnuts. Fallen leaves crackled softly beneath our feet, and the scent of wet earth filled the air. Every few steps, Tamaqua would stoop to pick up a shell or a smooth pebble, placing it with quiet care at the edge of the trail. He explained that the wampum he wore was not mere decoration. Each bead was carved from quahog or whelk shells and bore meaning. Some carried the memory of a treaty, others the echo of a prayer. The darker beads told of hardships, the lighter ones of peace. This one, he said, lifting a purple bead, was made when my grandfather first hunted alone. He handed me another. And this one, this was for a dream my mother had the night before I was born. I was struck by the way the Lenape wove memory not into books, but into objects, into the tactile, into sound and stone. History to them wasn't something to be kept in vaults. It was meant to be touched, worn, sung, and walked upon. At a clearing, he showed me a tree with wampum strands hanging from its low branches like wind chimes. They clicked softly in the breeze. This is the tree of promises, Tamaqua said. Each strand is a vow. When you walk beneath them, you must mean your words. Later, as we walked back, he gave me a single bead, white, simple, smooth. Now your story is part of the trail too, he whispered. And I knew in that moment that I had been given more than an artifact. I had been entrusted with memory. Whispers beneath the pines. There was a grove deep within Mannahatta's inner forest, where the pine trees grew taller than church spires and the earth was blanketed in a thick carpet of needles. The air there was always hushed, as if even the wind held its breath. The Lenape called this place Wenitchkikink, where the spirits listen. I would not have believed such things had I not stood there myself in the stillness. I accompanied a Lenape elder named Neko, whose hair was the color of frost and whose steps made no sound. He walked ahead of me barefoot, seemingly weightless, leaving no trail behind. Do not speak when you enter, he told me. The trees will remember your voice. At the grove's center stood a single ancient pine, broader than 3 men across, with bark cracked like an old map. Neko knelt before it, brushing away the fallen needles with a reverence that brought silence to even the birds. Here, he whispered, we speak to those who are no longer flesh. With the sun rising through the pines and dusting the forest in warm gold, I listened as he began to chant, not in sorrow but in memory. It was not a lament but a calling. He spoke names I did not know but felt as if they echoed in my bones, Kanta, Sipuan, Aluwalusit. For every name he placed a bundle of herbs, sweetgrass, sage, and cedar at the tree's roots. These are not offerings, he said, as if reading my mind. They are conversations. I stood back, observing this quiet dialogue between man and memory. The scent of the forest grew sweeter, richer, and I could swear the branches above us shivered with something more than wind. Then he turned to me. You came from far away, he said softly, but the ground beneath your feet is older than your maps. Before your ships, before your kings, we spoke here, not to ask for power, but to remember who we are. I realized that in this quiet glade, nothing had ever been truly forgotten. Every root curled around a story, every pine needle whispered an ancestor's name, and the land, this land, had not lost its voice. It was only waiting to be heard. The gnawing of the winds. The Lenape believed that the winds each bore names, and that to know them was to know the mood of the land. To the untrained ear, a breeze might seem aimless, a whisper lost in the trees, but to those raised among the rivers and forests of Mannahatta, the wind was as much a presence as a neighbor. They spoke of the southern wind, Loan, as a friend who brings warmth and carries news from distant lands. The northern wind, Taquin, came with stern breath, a watcher and reminder of all things that must rest. One late afternoon, I sat beside a boy no older than 12, named Tamaquis. He was carving a flute from a length of cedar, the blade in his hand moving with surprising confidence. You hear that? He asked, pausing. I listened, just the rustling of branches and the hush of air. I shook my head. He smiled and pointed to the treetops. That is Loan, he's laughing. My grandfather says he remembers stories, and when he laughs, the trees remember too. There was poetry in the way the Lenape lived, how they observed the world without demanding anything from it. They listened as much as they spoke, and when they named the winds, they did so not to command, but to honor. Cuilemeska, the breeze that comes before rain, was greeted with gratitude. Penteo, the sharp gust that swept through river valleys, was seen as a messenger, not feared but respected. That evening, as the last golden light bent through the canopy, Tamaquis played the first tentative notes on his flute. The sound was gentle, uncertain, like a new language being born. Around us, the trees seemed to hush. The wind that had earlier rustled with laughter now softened, circling in slow spirals above the clearing. I felt, for the briefest of moments, as though the boy in the air were speaking in a tongue older than memory itself. In a land increasingly carved by foreign axes and mapped by foreign hands, the Lenape still named the wind. They still sang to the air and carved their voices into cedar. It was their way of surviving, not by resisting the storm, but by remembering its name. The first fire circle. In the heart of the Lenape village stood a wide clearing, ringed with stones that had been warmed by centuries of flame. This was not merely a place for warmth, it was the cradle of story, judgment, laughter, mourning, and memory. They called it Welaheakan, the fire circle, and it burned with more than just wood. It burned with purpose. One twilight I was invited to sit among the elders as the fire was kindled. The gathering was sacred, no weapons, no anger, only truth. The youngest boy carried the flame from his mother's hearth, his steps measured and eyes wide. As he knelt to ignite the dry cedar and sage leaves, silence fell as if even the wind paused to witness. The fire caught slowly, then leapt with a crackle that felt ancient, as though awakening something deep in the bones of the earth. An elder named Maxxit, whose hair fell like gray river moss, rose with a painted gourd in his hands. He poured water in a slow circle around the fire, not to douse it, but to call the spirits to listen. Then he spoke, not in command, but in song. His words were not for the ears, but for the soul. The Lenape did not debate or declare around the fire. They shared, one voice at a time, one truth at a time. I remember a woman named Tuanima who spoke that night of her daughter's dream, the owl flying with a silver feather, a vision that had warned of illness weeks before a stranger's fever entered the village. None mocked her. No one dismissed the dream. Instead, they listened, nodded, and allowed the fire to hold the meaning. The fire circle was their parliament, their church, their theater. It was where lovers first held hands and warriors laid down their grief. Around it, treaties were made not with ink but with smoke and memory. The circle had no corners, no place to hide in judgment, no edge to fall from, only return. That night, as the fire turned from amber to coal, I realized this was no primitive rite. It was the height of civilization, to gather not to conquer but to understand, to listen without the need to answer, to let the fire warm the silence between words. And when the fire died down, no one moved to leave. They sat in the glow, wrapped in woven blankets and breath, as the stars above whispered their own quiet stories. The Bone Game. As the moon climbed above the canopy, its silver light spilled like silk across the forest floor, and the village prepared for a different kind of gathering, a ritual not of solemn reflection, but of spirited joy and ancient tradition. The Lenape called it Pehinikin, the Bone Game. It began with rhythm, drums made of deer hides stretched over hollowed wood, pulsing like the heartbeat of the island itself. Women sang from behind woven reed screens, their voices lilting and playful, rising in rounds. Children squealed as they were shooed back, wide-eyed and eager to see what only the elders would play this night. The Bone Game was more than sport, it was legend made flesh, a battle of wit and intuition, passed down since before the rivers bore names. The players sat on opposite sides of a long, narrow mat made from braided corn husks. In one hand, hidden under a cloak or a skillfully folded sash, was a small carved bone polished smooth with time, etched with symbols of water and wind. It would be hidden, passed, and guessed upon. The opposing team would chant, slap their thighs, and watch every twitch of eye and muscle to divine its location. It was a game of deception, yes, but not cruelty. Deceit was artful here, performed with laughter, not malice. To trick your opponent was a sign of cleverness, a gift from the trickster spirit, Maxquican. Elders played not to win, but to teach. Their glances were slow, their movements exaggerated, as if inviting the guests. One elder named Hitakwa was famous for never losing. With a sly smile and wrinkled hands, she could hold the bone in plain sight and still not be caught. That night she played once more, and when the young man across from her, his face tense with focus, guessed wrong, she cackled, tossed the bone in the air, and let it fall with a thud. Victory again. But the lesson came later when she pulled the youth aside, told him to feel the rhythm of the chant, to listen not with ears but with his chest. The bone, she whispered, is never truly hidden. It is your eyes that wander. The night swelled with music and storytelling. Food was passed, roasted corn, smoked fish, sweet nuts rolled in maple glaze. Stars turned slowly overhead, and in that small circle of light and sound, the world beyond disappeared. I had seen games in the colonies, loud, brutal, and fueled by coin, but this was something else. This was celebration as ceremony, joy as a teaching. It reminded me that the Lenape did not merely survive, they lived with grace, mischief, and deep, deliberate wonder. The Trail of Shells. Morning arrived with a hush. The dew had not yet burned off the leaves, and in the quiet hours just after dawn, a group of Lenape elders prepared for a journey, one not measured in miles but in memory. They were heading to a sacred site deep within the forest where the oldest wampum belt was kept, a living archive of agreements, alliances, and sacred law. The path they would take was known as Pamachqui, the Trail of Shells. Each footstep on that trail was deliberate. It wound through whispering ferns, across stone bridges formed by glacial boulders, and into shaded glens where time seemed to slow. This trail had no markers made of wood or sign. Instead, it was remembered in story, in rhythm, and in the placement of white and purple shells woven into the land itself, hidden beneath roots, nestled in tree hollows, placed by ancestors who had walked the same way generations before. I followed at a respectful distance, watching the procession of figures wrapped in bearhide cloaks, each holding something, a basket of tobacco leaves, a carved shell, a flute. They walked in silence, save for the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional trill of a bird greeting the sun. The forest changed as we walked. It grew denser, more ancient. The oaks here were older than any city wall I'd ever seen, their limbs twisting toward the heavens like outstretched arms frozen in worship. And beneath their canopy I felt something stir in my chest, a recognition that I had crossed into sacred space, into a place not measured by empire or title, but by presence and reverence. At the heart of a wide clearing, a stone circle stood. In its center was a wooden case lined with rabbit fur. Inside, carefully folded and wrapped, lay the belt, woven strands of quahog and whelk shell, polished to a deep violet and bone-white shimmer. Its pattern was dense with meaning, rows of jagged lines and curved shapes that spoke of rivers, seasons, kinship, and promises made in smoke and song. One elder named Taxgansa stepped forward. He spoke not to the group but to the belt itself, as if addressing a council of spirits. His voice was low and steady, recounting the treaties, the conflicts resolved, the lands shared. With each word he fingered a section of the belt, reminding all present of the sacred weight of memory. The moment lasted long beyond the speaking. We simply stood there in the filtered light, with the sound of wind in the trees and the scent of cedar rising. It was not until we turned to leave that I noticed a small child had quietly placed a single white shell on the edge of the trail. That, I was told, meant the memory would live on. The spirit of the fire circle. As dusk descended over the Lenape camp nestled along the eastern slope of Mannahatta, the world seemed to shift. The wind quieted, the trees leaned inward. It was time for the sacred fire, Axquin, the gathering that bound the present to the past through flame, story, and silence. The fire circle was not simply a place to sit. It was a portal, an altar, a living witness to everything the people had endured and everything they hoped to preserve. Stones, carried from distant rivers and passed down through generations, formed the ring. Each stone bore the marks of another time, scratches, burns, sometimes even the faint petroglyph of a bear claw or sun symbol. At the center, a fire was coaxed to life not with flint, but by the slow friction of two sacred sticks, one from ash, one from cedar. As the flames rose, people gathered, the young, the old, the quiet ones, and the spirited ones. They sat in respectful silence, forming a circle so wide and even that not one face was closer than the next. Every soul was equal before the fire. The elder who had lit it, a woman named Weluna, stood tall as she spoke. Her voice carried like wind over water, calm but unwavering. She did not begin with words of men, but with the language of birds, mimicking the call of the morning dove, the owl, and the wind-bent hawk. Each sound brought a murmur of recognition from those listening, as if she had summoned old companions into the space between fire and shadow. Then in Lenape tongue she began the story of Kepiai, the flame spirit who once danced in the hearts of every home, and how he fled when the people forgot to honor him. It was not a tale of punishment, but of longing of the bond between fire and people broken, then slowly mended with offerings of song, tobacco, and the tears of elders who remembered what others had let go. As she spoke, the fire shifted. Shapes seemed to rise within it, foxes, ancestors, the twisting form of a tree in storm. The children watched with wide eyes, and even the grown men, scarred and quiet, leaned forward. The fire was speaking back. When the tale ended, no one clapped. There was no need. Instead, a child offered a pinch of sweetgrass to the flame, and the smoke that rose carried it somewhere the wind could not reach. That night I sat far outside the circle, in the shadow of an old elm. I had heard hundreds of stories in my life, in salons and libraries, whispered in alleyways, carved into the pages of books, but none had touched the air the way that one did. None had made me believe that fire, too, could remember. The Watchers of the Water. Before the first fog lifted from the rivers, before even the birds dared to stir the morning air, there were always watchers at the water's edge. The Lenape called them Nekama, those who listened to the river not to speak but to understand. They were not warriors nor priests, they were listeners, guardians of signs, silent interpreters of the pulse of the land. The East River in those days was not yet carved by docks or fouled by smoke. It was a breathing thing, its tides a language that only the oldest knew how to read. The Nekama came wrapped in deerskin cloaks darkened by mist, carrying no tools but their eyes, their memories, and an unspoken reverence for what flowed before them. I once rose before dawn to follow them. I was younger then, still unsure of where awe ended and understanding began. From the cover of a mossy ridge, I watched as two elders knelt at the bank. They pressed their hands to the earth, palms facing down, not as a gesture of command, but of deference. Then they leaned forward, placing their ears near the water. For several minutes they didn't move, not even to blink. And then one of them spoke, not to me, but to the river. Kaxqui, he said. I later learned the word meant, we hear you. What were they listening for? I couldn't say with certainty, but I came to believe that the river told them things no man could, when the fish would return, when the storms would rise, and most crucially, when strangers were near. The Lenape did not fear change, but they knew to meet it with readiness, and the water, if honored, always warned them first. Later that day, one of the Nekama saw me hiding beyond the ridge. He said nothing, only motioned me forward. I approached nervously, unsure whether I had offended a ritual or broken some sacred distance. But the man simply pointed to the river, then to his own eyes. Don't just look, he whispered, witness. I have never forgotten that word, witness. It is not enough to see the world. One must let the world see into them, return their gaze, press its weight upon their conscience. That is what the Watchers of the Water taught me. Not superstition but attention, not magic but presence. The sacred fire never dies. There was a place tucked deep within the wooded heart of Mannahatta, where the trees opened in a perfect circle as though nature itself had stepped back in reverence. In the center stood a fire, not large, not wild, but constant. The Lenape called it Winkalesuwelik, the sacred fire, and they believed it had burned unbroken since the beginning of their people's memory. No matter the storm, no matter the snowfall, someone always kept the fire alive. Day and night, through sickness and celebration, it glowed like a steady heartbeat in the forest. Children were brought to it shortly after birth, the old were carried there when their time drew near. It was not a hearth for cooking or warmth, it was something far older, a living prayer. I first saw the fire as a boy, taken by my guide through thick brush and winding trails. The air around it was different, quiet, not from absence of sound, but from the fullness of presence. Women tended it most often, passing small bundles of cedar, tobacco, or sweetgrass into the flames. They did not speak unless the moment called for it. even whispers felt loud there. An elder, her long gray hair woven with feathers, knelt beside me. She motioned for me to close my eyes and listen. At first I heard only the fire's crackle, but slowly beneath that I felt rhythm, as if the flame breathed, as if it remembered. Every people has a song, she said gently. This fire is ours. It sings of our past, warns of our future, and warms our spirits in between. She told me that whenever a great change approached, be it joy or sorrow, the fire changed its voice. It flared brighter before births, it burned low and blue before losses, and sometimes, when the world beyond the forest threatened to press in too hard, it hissed as if to say, "Beware, they are near." To those outside the Lenape world, it may have seemed symbolic, just a tradition. But to those who had sat by its side for generations, it was a teacher, a sentinel, and a thread that tied them to everything that came before. And though the forests have long since fallen and the cities have risen in their place, I sometimes dream of that quiet circle, of the fire that never asked for praise, only attention, a sacred breath in the middle of the wilderness, whispering that to forget the fire is to forget oneself. Dreamwalkers and the spirit path. The Lenape did not believe that dreams were mere figments of sleep, nor idle wanderings of the mind. They spoke of dreams with reverence, as if they were travelers returning from distant lands, bearing messages not easily grasped in waking hours. To dream, they believed, was to step lightly upon Wenec, the spirit path, a realm as real and layered as the world of trees and stone. I recall one evening, the fire low and the stars loud in their brilliance, when an elder named Manitowit, his name meant "he who talks with shadows," spoke to me about the dreamwalkers. These were men and women trained from youth to read the dream language of the world. They fasted often, slept in solitude, and were guided by visions passed down from generations past. Your soul, he said, is not confined to this shell. It walks while you rest, and when it walks far enough, it may find knowledge your waking self is not ready for, but will need in time. He described how dreamwalkers interpreted the shape of a storm seen in a dream, or the call of a strange animal, or a song remembered upon waking. Each detail mattered. A hawk flying north meant a message from the ancestors. A river turned black in a dream was a warning of illness or imbalance in the tribe. Dreams of fire foretold both destruction and rebirth. Children were encouraged to speak of their dreams upon rising. No one dismissed a dream as just a dream. Even the smallest, most fleeting image could carry a seed of truth. It was said that some of the greatest decisions of the Lenape were made not in councils, but in dreams shared by elders who had seen the same vision on the same night. And in this sacred tradition, sleep became a ceremony. One lay down not to escape the day, but to seek guidance from the world behind the veil. In the white man's world, dreams were often brushed aside, fanciful or foolish, the mind's debris. But in the forests of Mannahatta, to dream was to see with the eyes of the soul. Even now I sometimes wake with the echo of drum beats in my ears, or the scent of sweetgrass, though I have not set foot in that sacred place for decades. And I wonder, did I return there in my sleep? Did my soul walk the old trails once more, unseen but never unwelcome? The sacred fires of council. There was a place deeper than the trees, a hollow veiled in fern and mist, where the sacred fires of the Lenape Council once burned. No path led directly to it. Only those with memory older than the forest itself could find their way there without becoming lost. It was not a place of words, but of decisions born from silence, respect, and the crackling voice of flame. I remember the hush that would fall over the village when the elders prepared for council. The young watched with awe as the fire bundle, embers cradled in birch bark, was carried with reverence through the woods. It was not merely fire they bore, but the spirit of continuity, the warmth that had lit the hearts of generations before. The circle was always formed in silence, stones placed with intention, each representing a clan, a story, a lineage. Elders sat not above but among, equal in voice. The flames were never started with haste. Dry cedar was laid first, then sweetgrass, and finally tobacco, a gift to the spirits that lingered in the leaves and shadows. Once lit, the fire spoke. Smoke rose in spirals as if reaching to the sky ancestors. Council would begin only after the fire had taken form, its dance mirroring the hearts of those gathered. No words were shouted. Every speaker held a talking stick, carved with ancient symbols, and no one interrupted its bearer. Decisions were not forced, but arrived upon like a canoe finding the river's current. I remember how the silence between words carried as much weight as the words themselves. An elder might speak of a dream, a migration of deer, or the sickness of rivers. Another might respond with a story handed down from the old times, told not to argue but to illuminate. The young were sometimes invited to sit nearby, not to speak but to listen, to absorb, to carry the memory forward when their turn came to keep the fire. That fire, I still see it in my mind's eye, glowing against the dark forest, smoke curling through the night air like prayers unspoken. It was more than flame, it was presence, it was witness. In a world now governed by noise and rush, I often long for that fire, that circle, that quiet space where truth burned steady and decisions rose like embers into the dark. The shaman's journey. Long before the missionaries came with their books and doctrines, the Lenape understood that the spirit world was as real as the one of soil and bark. Among them walked those who bridged the two realms, men and women who carried visions, who knew the language of trees and wind, who could speak to the sickness in a body or a dream. The shaman was not a title one claimed, it claimed you. Chosen by visions, marked by storms or suffering in youth, the path was often thrust upon those who had endured great trials. Some were said to have died and returned, others to have heard voices in the silence of snow or seen patterns in the flicker of fire that no one else could interpret. I remember one such man, Tall Cedar they called him. His real name was never spoken lightly. He walked with a slight limp, a gift from lightning they said had struck near him as a child. He wore a mantle of fox fur and carried a pouch of sacred herbs, bone charms, and river stones etched with symbols not even the elders could fully explain. Children were afraid of him and drawn to him all at once. He spoke rarely, but when he did, even the birds seemed to quiet. I remember how he would stand in the smoke of the ceremonial lodge, eyes half-lidded, whispering into the fire. Sometimes he would sing in a voice so old it seemed to belong to the rocks themselves. One winter a fever took hold of the village. No plant nor poultice could touch it. The mothers wept, the fires burned low, and death brushed close. It was then that Tall Cedar disappeared into the forest for 3 days. When he returned, he carried the bark of a tree no one had ever seen before, dark, bitter, and slick with sap. He brewed it into a tea and gave it to the sick. Some died still, for the sickness had reached too deep, but others lived enough that he became legend. They said he had walked into the dream world to wrestle the sickness and returned with the cure in hand. Others whispered that he had spoken with a spirit deer who had guided him to the medicine. But Tall Cedar never told. He only said, "The forest is generous to those who listen." When the settlers came, they called him mad. They feared his eyes, his silence, his way of speaking without words. But to us, he was not only healer, he was proof that the spirit world listened, and sometimes, if one dared enough to walk the path, it answered. Sides of the earth. Long before fences divided the land and deeds assigned ownership, the Lenape walked the island of Mannahatta with a different kind of understanding, one rooted not in possession, but in relationship. To them, the land was not a thing to be bought or sold. It was alive, it had memory, and it remembered who treated it with care. Each spring, when the frost loosened its grip, the women would gather along the gentle slopes and riverbeds. With hands calloused but tender, they pressed seeds into the warm soil, corn, beans, squash, the three sisters. These plants, grown together in sacred balance, were more than food. They were family. Corn rose tall to greet the sun, beans climbed her stalk for support, and squash spread low and broad, shielding the earth and preserving its moisture. It was the women who understood this cycle most intimately. They spoke to the earth as they worked, offering songs and breath to the soil. Every act, every planting, every harvest was a gesture of gratitude. Children watched their mothers with reverence, learning not just how to plant, but how to listen. I recall one such planting day as clearly as if it were yesterday. The morning mist had not yet lifted when we arrived at the clearing. Grandmother had brought a small pouch tied with deer sinew. Inside were the oldest seeds, saved from the harvest of her mother and her mother before that. She held them in her hand like jewels, whispering a prayer I was too young to understand. Then she handed them to me. With shaking fingers, I knelt beside her and pressed the seeds into the earth, one by one. The soil was soft and cool beneath my hands. "You must speak to them," she told me. "Tell them your name, tell them who your people are. That way, when they rise, they will know how to feed you." And so I did. In the distance, drums echoed, soft and steady, as other families worked their fields. The smoke of cooking fires curled lazily into the sky, mingling with birdsong and laughter. It was a good day, the kind that stitched itself quietly into the soul. Years later, when the Dutch and then the English laid claim to these lands, they brought tools of steel and concepts of ownership. But they could never understand what it meant to be planted in a place, to belong not above the land, but within it. Even now, when I hold soil in my hand, I remember that morning. I remember her voice, and I remember the seeds, warm from her palm, entrusted to mine. Songs of the Night Fire. When twilight descended upon the forests of Mannahatta, a different rhythm awakened beneath the canopy. The Lenape, bound by generations of oral tradition, gathered in circles of flame and shadow to keep memory alive, not on parchment, but in voice, in drum, and in story. The night fire was more than a source of warmth, it was a sacred threshold. Its light parted the veil between worlds, the world of the living and the echoes of the ancestors. Around it, young and old alike sat in reverent silence, as the first beat of the deer-hide drum pulsed like a heartbeat across the earth. Elders began to chant, low, measured, and hauntingly beautiful. Their voices rose and fell in patterns older than the stones beneath them. These songs were not performances, they were invocations, keys that opened the memory of the land itself. I remember one night clearly, when the moon hung low and orange over the treetops and the owls had not yet spoken. My father, usually so quiet, stepped forward into the circle. His shadow danced behind him on the bark of the great pine as he raised the turtle-shell rattle in one hand and the stories in his throat. He sang of Sky Woman who fell from the heavens and landed upon the back of a giant turtle, the earth we now walk. He sang of the trickster Messingwa who wandered the woods with laughter and lessons in his wake. He sang of the spirit winds that shape the rivers and the firebird who watches over the east. Children leaned against their mothers, eyes wide with wonder. Warriors sat still as stone, hearing in his voice not just tales but instructions, how to live, how to hunt with honor, how to mourn, how to forgive. In his breath was the forest, in his rhythm the river. As the song faded, no applause followed, only the soft crackle of fire and the hush of wind in the leaves. Respect was not shown in cheers but in silence. We knew we had been given a gift. Later that night, when the embers dimmed and the circle dispersed, I lingered by the fire pit. The smoke curled upward as if carrying the words to the stars. I pressed my fingers to the earth where my father had stood. It was still warm. Even now, when I walk alone beneath a dark sky, I hum fragments of those songs. I do not always remember the words, but the feeling, the weight, the wisdom, the fire, I carry that with me still. Whispers beneath the earth. Beneath the soil of Mannahatta, deeper than the roots of the great oaks and older than the rivers themselves, lived a silence that was never truly empty. The Lenape believed that the earth spoke, not in words but in breath, through the tremble of leaves, the hush of moss underfoot, and the deep hum of stone. It was in this silence that the medicine men and women, the Pewais, heard what others could not. They did not seek answers with loud prayers or bold proclamations. Instead, they listened, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. They lay on the forest floor, ear pressed against the cool ground, listening for the movements of the unseen. I once followed one such healer, a woman named Atena, who was said to have the ears of the deer and the dreams of the fox. She was neither young nor old, wrapped in a faded cloak of bark-dyed cloth and necklaces of bone and crystal. Her eyes, dark and deep, held something ancient. We came to a hollow where the earth sank in a soft cradle of ferns. Without a word, she dropped to her knees and laid her ear upon the moss. I stood still, uncertain, until she motioned for me to do the same. What I heard was not a voice, it was a rhythm, the gentle creak of roots shifting, the faint tapping of water beneath stone, a pulse steady and slow, as if the island itself had a heart. I closed my eyes, and for a moment I could feel the shape of the island in my chest, its curves, its breath, its waiting. Atena whispered to me then, "This land remembers. Every footstep, every seed, every drop of blood, it holds them all. Listen long enough and you will know what it carries." She told me that the rocks kept stories and the trees told time, that when the people forgot, the earth did not, and it would speak to those who knew how to listen, not to command, but to understand. That night I lay awake near the camp, staring at the stars through the canopy above. The noises of the forest no longer sounded random. I could hear meaning in them, not language but feeling, not speech but truth. Years later, long after Atena had vanished into the wilderness, I would find myself kneeling again on moss-covered ground in silence. And in that stillness, beneath all things, I would remember that the greatest stories were not always told aloud. They were whispered beneath the earth, when the sky would speak. In the old times, the Lenape people believed the sky was not a ceiling, but a spirit, a presence vast and watchful, breathing above their lives with rhythms that could be read like stories. They called it Kishilemukong, the dwelling place of the Creator, where the great winds were born and where dreams drifted before entering the minds of sleeping children. It was said the sky could speak, not in thunder alone or rain, but in the way clouds shape themselves into warnings or promises, in the color of dawn, in the flight of geese, in the eerie stillness that sometimes came before great change. There was a season when the birds flew differently, lower, closer to the trees, moving with an urgency the people had not seen before. The elders grew quiet, watching the heavens each morning and each dusk. "The sky is uneasy," said a man named Callowin, whose face was lined like tree bark and whose eyes had watched more seasons than I could count. One night I was awoken by a strange blue glow, soft and otherworldly, spilling over the treetops. The sky above our clearing shimmered with what looked like a moving curtain of light. The elders gathered in silence, their breath steaming in the cold air, their faces lit by the celestial dance. Callowin placed his hand on my shoulder and whispered, "The ancestors are watching. Tonight we listen." And so we did, no drums, no chants, just the quiet awe of a people raised to feel the meaning in light and wind. Later he told me that such signs appeared rarely and never without cause. They were often a warning, sometimes a blessing. When the sky speaks, he said, it is not for us to explain, it is for us to prepare. In the weeks that followed, the game became scarce. Rivers shifted in their flow. Strange footprints were found at the edge of the village, bare feet, wide and unfamiliar. Callowin claimed it was the first ripple of a great wave that would one day wash across Mannahatta. And when it came, when the strangers arrived with sails like the clouds and thunder that came not from storms but from guns, many remembered that night, that shimmering sky, that unspoken message. Not all wisdom comes from earth or fire. Some comes from above, painted in stars, carried in winds, and sometimes in the silence before a storm. The forest remembers. There was a path, narrow and half-hidden, winding deep into the oldest part of the Mannahatta forest. No one dared clear it. The elders said the forest guarded it for a reason, and only those who listened with more than ears could find their way through. I was led there once, only once, by a woman named Tula, the last of her bloodline known for walking with spirits. Tula moved with a grace that seemed taught by the earth itself. Her steps were silent, her breath matched the rhythm of the leaves. I was a child then, still too full of questions and noise, but she had agreed to show me the sacred grove, the place where the forest remembered. It was not marked by stone or carving, but by the weight of silence. When we arrived, the air changed, birds no longer sang, the wind slowed, and even the insects grew still. The trees stood older here, their trunks twisted with age, their roots thick as sleeping serpents. Moss clung to every surface like ancient memory. "This is where the old ones dwell," Tula whispered, kneeling and placing both hands upon the soil. "Their bones feed these roots, their dreams echo in the bark." She invited me to kneel beside her, and I obeyed, heart pounding. I felt it then, a pulse, faint, deep beneath the ground, like the slow heartbeat of something ancient and endless. It wasn't frightening, it was sad, as if the land itself carried the sorrow of stories long forgotten. Tula closed her eyes. She began to hum a low, wordless tune. The sound curled through the trees like smoke, and as I listened, the grove seemed to breathe. Leaves trembled without wind. A squirrel froze mid-step. Even the light filtering through the canopy shifted, casting patterns I had never seen before, shapes like faces, arms, wings. "They remember us," Tula said, tears glinting on her cheeks, "but we forget them." When we left, I looked back once. The path was already vanishing, swallowed by fern and shadow. I tried to return many times in the years that followed, but I never found it again. The elders say the land forgets nothing, the forest especially. It holds every footprint, every promise, every broken truth beneath its roots. We walk atop 1,000 silent stories, and if we pause long enough, it is still possible to hear them whisper. The river that spoke. Among the Lenape, the river was never merely water. It was a living being, ancient and listening. The elders called it Mahakanatuk, the river that flows two ways, because the tides from the great ocean pushed against its current, and in that meeting something sacred stirred. I was taught to greet the river like a grandfather, to bow my head and whisper my breath to its surface before ever taking a drink or stepping near. There was a place we called the Bend where the river dreams. It was a smooth crescent of bank hidden behind willow trees, where the current slowed and the water grew deep and still. It is said that on certain nights, especially when the moon was hollow and stars were clear, the river would speak. I remember one such night. My uncle, who was known for weaving stories even the fire would lean in to hear, brought me there with only a small torch and a pouch of tobacco. He didn't say much on the walk, he only told me, "The river speaks if you know how to wait." We sat in silence, listening to the wind nudge the willows and the occasional splash of fish. After what felt like an eternity of quiet, he stood, walked to the edge, and tossed the tobacco into the water. Then he began to speak not to me but to the river. He spoke of a dream he had, a vision of our people walking through fire, of forests turning to stone, of children forgetting the old names. His voice did not waver. He offered no demand, only sorrow and remembrance. When he fell silent, the water rippled without wind. A heron, still as death, watched us from a fallen branch. Suddenly the air grew heavy, and the water shimmered as if touched by moonlight, though no moon was there. Then came the voice, not words, but a feeling that pressed against the bones, a weight that filled the chest with both dread and comfort. The river was mourning. My uncle wept not from fear but recognition. "It remembers," he whispered. Since that night I have never again heard the river speak. but sometimes when I stand at that bend, I feel the memory of it, a soft pulse like the hush before tears, and I know it still listens, even if we've forgotten how to speak its name. The Bone Carver's Gift. There was a man in our village known only as the Bone Carver. No one remembered his true name, and no one dared to ask. He was old, older than any tree in the Longhouse Grove, and his eyes held 1,000 winters. He lived at the edge of the forest in a lodge built of bark, bone, and silence. Children were warned not to disturb him, yet every one of us tried. His work was sacred. From the bones of deer, bear, fish, and even birds, he carved tokens, not trinkets but stories. Each tiny sculpture, no larger than a finger, bore more meaning than a whole tale told around the fire. A woman who had lost her child might be given a crane with wings folded in prayer. A warrior returning from battle might receive a fox with its head bowed and tail curled, and though he rarely spoke, each gift changed those who received it. I remember the first time I was summoned to his lodge. I was 12, just after my brother drowned in the creek. I had screamed and fought the river, cursed it, blamed it. My voice was hoarse for days. Then one evening, a soft knock on our longhouse door. A child no older than I was handed me a bundle of deer hide. "For you," he said, then ran. Inside, nestled in folds of soft fur, was a bone carving of 2 fish, one swimming upward, the other downward, their tails entwined in a circle. It was smooth and cold to the touch, yet warm with meaning. I stared at it all night, feeling its silence speak louder than any condolence. The next morning I walked to the bone carver's lodge. I wanted to thank him, to understand how he knew, but he did not open the door. Instead, hanging on a low branch outside his hut, I found a string of carvings dancing in the wind: an owl, a leaf, a human eye, a cracked shell. Symbols not meant to be understood by the mind, but by the spirit. The elders said he once carved for the sachems, the spiritual leaders, and even the ancestors. Some believed he could see into dreams. Others thought he was part of the forest itself, made of bark and ash, come to life only when grief called for it. Years later, when the strangers came with iron and fire, the bone carver disappeared. His lodge was found empty, his tools gone. But near the river bend, on a stone where he once sharpened bone blades, someone found a final carving, a bear with a shattered paw staring into the sky. It was left on a red cloth beneath a single feather. No one could explain it, but every year on the coldest night of winter, someone hangs it on the highest branch of the council tree, so that it may speak to the wind and remember. The Skywoman's Song. Before there were rivers, trees, or even the soil beneath our feet, our grandmothers say there was only Skyworld. Up above, in that place of light and song, lived the Sky People, and among them was Skywoman, a being of deep grace, whose voice was said to calm storms and awaken blossoms. She was not Lenape in name, for this was before names, before nations, before the world as we knew it. The story came to us not as words, but as breath carried by drums. At night, the elders would beat a slow rhythm and sing her descent. I remember my mother swaying gently to that song, eyes closed, whispering the tale so it would not be forgotten. Skywoman fell from the skyworld when the roots of the Tree of Light were disturbed. Some say pulled by curiosity, others say by fate. She fell through the endless dark, cradling a bundle of seeds from the tree's heart, falling not with fear, but with purpose. As she neared the great waters below, the beings of the deep, beaver, muskrat, turtle rose to meet her. They saw her light, saw her grief, and her power. It was the muskrat who, though smallest, dove the deepest and surfaced with mud from the ocean floor. Upon Turtle's back this mud was placed, and there Skywoman landed. From her hands she planted the seeds. From her tears the rivers flowed. From her footprints forests grew. This island Mannahatta is her breath, the wind through the trees, her whisper, the soil we dig into to grow corn and squash, her gift. We walk each day on the back of Turtle, under Skywoman's gaze, even if we forget to look up. And so every spring when the buds appear, the clan mothers sing her song again. Not in mourning, but in thanks. They dress in robes of deerhide and beadwork, their voices rising into the night, trembling like firelight. It is said the stars brighten when they do, reminders that we are not apart from the world, but of it. In a time when new stories threaten to silence the old, we remember Skywoman not just as myth, but as truth told in metaphor, passed from lips to earth, from earth to heart. The Three Sisters. Beneath the warming sun of early spring, when the frost had just loosened its grip upon the soil, the Lenape women would step into the fields with songs in their throats and seeds in their hands. These seeds were not merely crops, they were kin. Corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters. In our stories, they are more than plants, they are sacred siblings, each offering her gift to the others and to us. Corn, tall and proud, was always planted first. She stretches toward the sky like a pillar of light, providing strength and support. Next came the bean, whose vines would climb up corn's stalk, twining around her sister's body like a promise of unity. And then squash, the low and generous one, was planted around them, her broad leaves shielding the soil from weeds and the sun's thirst. Together they grew as a family, and like a family, they thrived through interdependence. The corn gave the bean something to hold, the bean fed the soil with its roots, and the squash protected them all, encircling them like a mother. It was more than agriculture, it was a reflection of Lenape life, where survival meant cooperation, not conquest. I remember my grandmother kneeling in the garden behind our longhouse. Her hands, worn from years, dug gently into the earth as she whispered to each seed. She would hum the old tunes, low and rhythmic, calling upon the ancestors and the spirits of the land. She believed the plants listened, that the earth could feel our intentions, and maybe it did, for the three sisters always answered our care with abundance. In the long winters, when the rivers froze and the woods stood silent, it was their dried kernels, pods, and fruit that kept us alive. Their sustenance was memory itself, of warmer days, of hands that planted, and of the earth that held us. Now, as fields disappear beneath timber and stone, and the sisters are no longer sung to, I still hear their voices in the wind. They call not just to be remembered, but to be restored. The naming ceremony. When a Lenape child was born, it was not merely the start of a life, it was the return of a spirit, a thread stitched back into the living tapestry of our people. The first few days were sacred. The mother rested in quiet dignity, surrounded by elder women, while the men kept the fire steady and the songs gentle. The newborn, swaddled in soft deerskin, was never far from the breast, from the heartbeat, from the warmth of the world. The naming ceremony came after the infant's first full moon. We believed that during those early days the child still straddled the veil between this world and the next. To name them too soon was to call them fully into being before they were ready. So we waited, we observed, and we listened. The name was never chosen at random, nor was it imposed. The elders, especially the grandmothers, watched the child's movements, the dreams of the mother, the signs in nature. A hawk circling above the birth hut, a dream of running water, the way the baby reached toward firelight. These were not coincidences, they were messages. When the time came, all gathered under the open sky. The child was lifted into the dawn light, and an elder, usually the most respected woman in the clan, spoke the name aloud for the first time. It might be Quiet River, or Little Cedar, or He Who Follows the Wind. That name would guide the child, shape their destiny, and carry the wisdom of the spirits. I recall my own naming ceremony, not in memory but in story. I was born during a storm that had come suddenly in early summer, and as the thunder rolled across Mannahatta, a great turtle appeared near the village creek. My grandmother said it was a sign. She named me Mahakantuak, he who walks with thunder. All my life I have carried that name as both blessing and burden. Now children are given names from distant tongues, James, Elizabeth, Thomas, names with no roots in our soil. But sometimes when I hear the wind through the trees or see a child stare into firelight, I wonder if the old spirits still whisper, waiting to name them once more. The fire circle. At the heart of every Lenape village burned a fire that never died. It was not merely for warmth or cooking, it was the center of our spiritual and communal life. We called it the fire circle, and around it every story, every judgment, every bond of love or sorrow found its shape. The fire was our witness, our ancestor, and our future. Evening came early in the forests of Mannahatta. As shadows lengthened and the world quieted, people of all ages would gather around the circle. Grandparents would settle onto fur-covered logs, children on their knees, listening wide-eyed. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the darkening sky like fireflies joining the stars. Smoke wove its way upward in thin tendrils, carrying our voices with it. There were times of storytelling, of singing, of quiet drum beats echoing through the soil. A man would speak of a hunt gone wrong, a woman might tell of a dream she could not forget. Young men tested their voices in songs, while older ones nodded in approval or smiled gently in silence. Here news was shared, wisdom passed, jokes traded, and grief held. No one was turned away, for the fire belonged to all. The circle also served as a place of justice. Disputes were not settled with anger, but through counsel and patience. A man who had wronged his brother would speak his truth before the fire, and the elders, wrapped in deer hides, would listen. Judgment was not punishment, it was restoration. The fire demanded not vengeance, but harmony. And always someone tended it, even as the world around us began to change, even as strange men with pale faces built fences and churches, we kept our fire. A boy would rise in the night to feed it. A mother, nursing her child, would glance to ensure its glow remained. When the fire was strong, so were we. Now there are no more fire circles on Mannahatta. There are street lamps, neon lights, glowing signs that do not remember us. But sometimes when I walk these streets, I see people gather around bonfires at protests, candles at vigils, or even just sharing stories under the orange wash of a city light, and I wonder, does some member of our fire circle still burn in them, waiting? The Path of Stones. There was a trail we called the Path of Stones, worn by countless feet, sunken in places where the earth remembered us. It wound through the forest like a river of memory, lined with flat, moss-covered rocks that our ancestors had placed with purpose. They said the stones carried the breath of the land, and that by walking this path you could feel the pulse of Mannahatta beneath your steps. It was more than a road, it was a living history. Elders walked the path in silence, fingers brushing the bark of familiar trees. Children, at first loud with play, would grow quiet as they stepped between the stones. Something in the hush of leaves, in the way sunlight filtered through the canopy, made you listen differently. The birdsong here was older, deeper. The wind carried not just scent but song, an ancient melody that needed no words. Along the way were markers, a rock shaped like a turtle shell where offerings were left, a split oak tree we called the Whisperer, which creaked softly in the wind, and a clearing where wild strawberries grew, said to bloom even in sorrowful years. The path led from our village to the edge of the water, where canoes once launched to meet the rivers. It passed hunting grounds, sacred groves, and burial mounds. It was how we moved, yes, but also how we remembered. Each bend in the path held a story, of a bear who spared a boy, of lovers who fled under moonlight, of warriors who danced before their first journey. My mother once told me that walking the path of stones was like walking through our soul, every footprint added to the spirit of the people. When I last walked it, the forest was already thinning. The stones were still there, but some had been pushed aside by wheels, others swallowed by roots. Yet I could still feel it, that hush, that pulse, a whisper beneath the noise of progress, asking not to be forgotten. The Lenape did not leave written maps, but the land held our lines, our signs, our steps. And if you ever find yourself alone in a forest where the wind sings without reason, where stones seem to lead somewhere unknown, perhaps you have stumbled onto a piece of our path. The sky between the branches. There were days when I would lie on my back beneath the great canopy and look up, not at the trees themselves, but at the spaces between them. The sky broke through in slivers, in fragments framed by branches like windows to a higher world. We called it Keksku, the sky between the leaves, a sacred sight that reminded us the heavens were always watching, always whispering. The Lenape saw no firm line between sky and earth. The breath of the world moved in cycles, rain falling, rivers rising, mist curling upward like prayers returning to their makers. Birds flying through those sky windows were seen as messengers, sometimes spirits, sometimes omens. Their patterns carried meaning. The flight of a hawk could change a day's hunt, the call of a loon could guide a traveler home. On quiet afternoons, elders would bring us to the groves to teach us how to read the sky's language. We were shown how cloud shapes foretold weather, how the color of dusk told of tomorrow's winds, how the moon's face changed with the rhythm of the earth's breath. These were not superstitions. These were observations, rooted in centuries of attention. The most sacred moments came at dawn or twilight, when the trees glowed like copper and the sky turned flame orange or violet. In those hours, we believed the spirits of the sky and land touched, what my grandmother called the thinning of the veil. She said if you stood still and opened your heart, you might hear your ancestors' voices riding the wind. One autumn evening, when I was no older than 10, I lay beneath a towering elm and saw a hawk soar straight through the break in the canopy. Behind it, clouds parted to reveal a shaft of golden light. For a moment, everything around me stilled. No birds called, no leaves moved, and I felt, deep in my bones, that I was not alone. That was our way, not to conquer the world, but to belong to it, to lie quietly, to watch, to learn, and to listen to the space between the branches. When the fire danced in circles. There were nights when the fire in the village center spoke more clearly than any elder's tongue. The flames would rise and sway, casting long shadows of dancers and children on the lodge walls. We called those evenings Patamawi, nights of the dancing fire, when stories and spirits circled us in equal measure. The Lenape understood fire as more than warmth or light, it was memory. Each spark carried echoes of old laughter, old sorrow. Our hearths were not merely functional, they were sacred spaces, portals between the living and the unseen. When the community gathered, it was not just to eat or to rest, it was to remember. That night I sat with my uncle, a man whose voice rumbled low like distant thunder. He told a tale of how the stars were once fireflies, trapped in a jar by a curious child spirit who wanted to keep the sky near. But when the jar broke, the light scattered and rose high, where they still flicker above us to this day. As he spoke, the fire flared suddenly and without wind, and every child leaned forward. A gust of heat struck our faces. In that moment, it felt as though the story had leapt into the flames, come alive, and was dancing with us. The women's shadows moved in rhythm, skirts flicking like leaves. Drums echoed like the heartbeat of the world. One elder began to chant, her voice rising and falling like the hills we slept beneath. Her words told of a warrior who once danced alone in the forest to bring rain, and whose spirit still returns when the thunder drums. The fire crackled and answered her. Sparks jumped high and vanished into the night. I could see my grandfather's profile lit in amber, his eyes closed in memory. We didn't fear the dark, we filled it with meaning. We gathered our people around the flames and stitched ourselves to one another in story and breath and shared silence. And when the fire finally died down, no one rose too quickly. We sat in the hush it left behind, warmed by the stories still echoing in our bones. The forest had no fences. Before lines were drawn, before metal stakes bit into the soil, the forest breathed freely from ocean's edge to the river's bend. To the Lenape, land was not a possession, it was a parent. We walked upon it not as owners, but as children, careful not to bruise what fed us. There were no fences, no boundaries marked in ink or stone. We knew whose family gathered nuts beneath a particular grove, or whose grandmother taught songs by the creek where otters played. But this was not ownership, it was relationship and understanding between people and place. When you tread the same path each spring, when you gather roots from the same marsh each fall, you do not need paper to tell you it is home. As a child, I wandered far with my cousins, barefoot through the ferns, across mossy boulders, under branches heavy with memory. We learned the taste of the earth through our souls. Every tree had a voice, and some, like the towering tulip poplar near the forked stream, carried voices of our ancestors. We would pause there, sometimes without speaking, and listen. A clearing in the forest was not an empty space, but a heartbeat exposed. It was where deer came to feed and where the wind gathered to tell secrets. I recall once seeing my mother kneel in such a place, whispering to the ground before taking a single plant. She taught me to thank with both hands, one to receive and one to give back. That reverence ran through every breath of our lives. To disrespect the land was to dishonor your own blood. That is why the idea of land being sold, being chopped into squares and traded, was more than confusing. It was terrifying. Later, when men in wool coats came with their rolled parchments and iron tools, we watched from the trees. They spoke of property, borders, contracts, but to us, it was like carving lines through the wind and claiming it. We did not understand. Even now in dreams, I walk those ancient trails, the ones that twist like vines between memory and root. I see again the forest without fences, open like a mother's arms, welcoming not just our feet, but our prayers. Voices of the council fire. When the sun slipped low beyond the river's bend and the shadows of the pines stretched long, the fire in the center of the village would be lit, not for warmth, but for wisdom. That was the hour of council, when words carried the weight of generations, and silence spoke just as clearly. The fire did not belong to one family or clan. It was the voice of the whole, the pulse of the people. Around it sat the elders, their faces weathered like bark, their eyes glinting with the knowledge of 1,000 winters. Younger ones like me sat quietly behind them, close enough to feel the heat, far enough to learn respect. We were taught that listening was an act of courage, not of passivity. Each speaker rose only when the hush had fully fallen. They spoke slowly, not because they were unsure, but because each word mattered. No one interrupted, no one rushed, even the crackling wood seemed to pause in reverence. The council fire did not judge by volume or wealth, but by clarity, by truth. And when someone finished, there was no applause, only silence again as we let the words settle into our marrow. I remember my uncle standing once with a stone in his palm. He told the council that the stone was like our future, shaped by pressure, held in memory. He said, "What we decide tonight is not for us alone, it is for the children of our children." That night I realized that leadership was not power, it was guardianship. The council fire decided when to plant and when to rest. It decided whether to move the village or stand firm. It decided when to greet the Dutch with open hands and when to retreat like foxes into the forest. But more than decisions, the fire kept alive the one thing we could not survive without: unity. In later years, I stood beside that fire myself, older, trembling, and with my own voice to offer. I remembered then the long silences of the elders and understood them for the first time, not emptiness, but space for truth to emerge. Now the forest is quieter and the fire no longer burns nightly, but if you walk carefully near the old riverbank, you might still hear echoes in the wind, soft murmurs of agreement, dissent, laughter, and tears. The voices of the council fire are never truly gone. They live in those who choose to listen. The earth as mother, the river as blood. Before I could walk, I was laid upon the soil, not in a cradle, not in woven bark, but upon the living ground, cool, fragrant, and humming with quiet breath. My grandmother pressed her hand to my chest and whispered, "This is your first teacher." She meant the earth, whose lessons would take a lifetime to understand. To the Lenape, the earth was never mere ground, it was mother. Her skin was the moss and loam, her bones the rocks, her breath the wind. From her we took only what we needed, and even then we offered thanks. When a tree was felled, a prayer was said. When berries were gathered, the youngest child was taught to leave the first handful for the birds. Our elders believed that to live well was not to take less but to take mindfully. And the river, oh, the river was her blood. The Shaitmuck, wide and eternal, flowed not only with water but with time. We drank from it, bathed in it, traveled upon its currents. Children learned to read its moods before they learned to speak. Its rise and fall told us when to fish, when to plant, when to listen. I remember a summer morning when I followed my mother to the water's edge. She cupped her hands and drank, then motioned for me to do the same. Taste, she said, and remember, it is older than us both. I tasted it, cool and clear, and felt suddenly small, but not in fear. It was the smallness of being cradled, of belonging. When the Dutch built their ships and dams, the river wept quietly. Its paths shifted, its rhythms broken. The fish no longer came in their former abundance. Our canoes, once gliding like dragonflies, now rocked against the wake of larger vessels. Yet still, the river remained, watching. In those days our prayers grew longer, more desperate. The earth was still our mother, but we had learned she could be wounded. We saw trees cut not for firewood but for profit. We saw land fenced, claimed, renamed. And though our footsteps grew lighter, the sorrow deepened. Even now I sometimes walk alone through the remnants of our hunting paths. The soil still breathes, the river still murmurs, though in a different tongue. I place my hand on the ground, as my grandmother once did, and whisper, "We are still listening." The smoke of memory. The scent of burning sweetgrass still lingers in my bones. It was morning when we gathered in the council longhouse, a time not marked by clocks but by the hush of birds before sunrise. The elders sat in a circle, their faces carved by time and story. In the center, the sacred fire had already been lit, its smoke spiraling upward, thin, blue, alive. I remember how grandfather took a pinch of dried tobacco from his pouch and whispered to it. "For those who came before us," he said, casting it into the flames. The smoke welcomed it, crackling softly, then rose toward the thatched roof as if searching for ears beyond our world. The fire was not for warmth, it was for remembering. We believed that memory, like smoke, could travel upward, through the seams between sky and leaf, between breath and silence. The fire called the spirits near, not to haunt but to listen, and we spoke to them, not in fear or longing but in quiet recognition, that they still walked among us, unseen but not forgotten. Each person who entered the longhouse passed through the smoke. It clung gently to skin and hair, reminding us that we were not separate from the past. Even children who understood little of its meaning grew still in its presence. I watched my cousin, barely 5 winters old, bow his head in mimicry, eyes wide with wonder. On that day we remembered more than ancestors. We remembered promises. Stories were told not as entertainment but as medicine. A tale of the turtle's back upon which the earth was formed. A parable of the fox who forgot gratitude and lost his voice. Each story was a thread pulled from the smoke, woven into us. But the smoke changed. When strangers came, they brought new fires, coal forged, smoke that bit the nose and clouded the stars. Their memory was not circular but straight, moving forward and leaving ash behind. Our sacred fires were called superstition, our stories dismissed as myth. And yet we continued. In secret glades we lit small bundles of sweetgrass and cedar. We whispered the names of our elders into the dusk. We held the smoke between our fingers and said, "Remember." Sometimes when the wind is just right, I smell it again, a flicker in the air, soft and sacred, and I close my eyes not to escape but to see more clearly. The fire is still burning, the memory still rising. Echoes in the stone. There was a place on the island that no longer exists, not as it once did. We called it Wigwank, meaning a gathering place of voices. It was a low hill near the freshwater streams, where stones shaped by time and hand formed a wide circle. Even the animals seemed to respect its quiet. Deer paused at its edge, birds sang lower, and the wind there often moved without sound. It was said that if you stood in the center and listened, truly listened, you could hear the voices of those who had stood there before, not as words but as rhythms, as pulse, as memory. I stood there once, years before the men in iron buckles arrived. My uncle, a keeper of songs, brought me to the circle before my nomming. "Every stone here holds a name," he told me, placing his hand on a moss-covered boulder. "Some speak only when you are ready to hear." He told me of a woman who had once stood in the circle with tears on her cheeks, her infant wrapped tight to her chest. She sang a song of the river's sorrow because it could never stay. That song, he said, still lingered in the stones, worn soft by wind and foot but never truly forgotten. And I remember placing my ear to one of them. I heard nothing at first, then slowly, impossibly, I felt something deep, like the beat of a drum beneath the earth. Not loud, not even sound, just presence, a knowing, as if the stone remembered me long before I was born. Wigwank was not sacred because we said so. It was sacred because it carried what we left behind, not tools or carvings, but breath and silence, footsteps and longing. The kind of memory not written, but lived. When the settlers came, they cleared the area. Trees fell. The stones were broken apart, carted away to build walls and roads. Some were used to form the foundation of their new church. I passed by it once long after and laid my hand against the cold stone wall. For a moment I thought I felt it again, that pulse. Maybe they thought they erased us, but stones, like stories, endure. You may walk Manhattan's paved streets now and see only concrete, but beneath it the voices remain, quiet, patient, waiting for someone to listen. The day the sky changed. It was midday when they first arrived, those ships with towering sails like wings of giant sea birds. We had seen traders before, men who came and left with goods and trinkets, but this was different. I remember the sound of the water breaking against their hulls as they approached. The gulls circled but did not cry. The wind paused as if to watch, and from the edge of the great island we watched 24 of us, silent beneath the trees, unsure whether to run or to stand. They came not with greetings but with walls, not with songs but with plans. Our people had long read the sky for signs, the flight of birds, the shapes of clouds, even the hush of insects before a storm. That day the sky changed. It was not its color, it was something else. A feeling, a stillness beneath the sun, as though time had drawn in a breath and refused to let it out. The newcomers landed not on bare rock but on earth that remembered, soil that held stories, sand where children had danced and elders had sung. They did not ask what was sacred or what had meaning. They cleared, carved, claimed. I saw a boy no older than I was then step off the ship and look around with wonder. He waved at me. I did not wave back, not from anger but from a sorrow I could not name. We were two children watching the same shore, standing on different sides of history. That evening the council met. Some said we must leave, find new land deeper in the woods. Others said we must stay, that we belonged here more than anyone ever could. But even the fire that night felt colder. I lay awake listening to the sea. The rhythm of the waves had changed. Where once it whispered, it now beat against the land like a warning. The sky had changed, and though no one yet knew how, so would everything beneath it. The silent council. That night the longhouse filled with the smell of cedar smoke and the murmurs of anxious breath. The elders gathered in a circle, the sacred fire burning low at the center, casting trembling shadows on the woven walls. The flames whispered and crackled as if listening. Every voice was hushed but heavy with centuries of wisdom and the weight of a future unclear. One Throp, the oldest among them, sat cross-legged, his back impossibly straight despite the years that bent others. His voice was slow, shaped not by anger but by memory. I have seen 3 great winters when the river froze solid as stone. I have heard thunder speak before rain dared fall. And I say this, these men who come, they do not see the land, they only see what they can take from it. A younger man, Stuyton, clenched his fists. Then we must not let them, we drive them back to the sea. As our grandfathers did with the Iroquois, so shall we do again. But murmurs rippled through the circle. A woman named Wea, known for visions that came true as dreams, spoke next. Their strength does not come only from weapons but from something deeper. They carry belief. They believe the land belongs to them even before they touch it, and belief, once planted, grows faster than roots. There was silence then, heavy, ancient. Outside the wind shifted, brushing against the longhouse like a hand seeking entry. An elder spoke for the first time. His name was Tamnund, and when he spoke it was as though the fire bowed. We are the children of this earth. The land remembers our feet, our songs are dead. If we leave, we become shadows. If we fight, we may become ghosts. But if we remain still and wise, like the bear in winter, we may yet see another spring. His words, soft as they were, held the room still. No decision was made that night, only understanding. And that was the beginning of a silence that would stretch across seasons, a silence not of fear, but of watching, of knowing that storms do not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes they step ashore quietly, wearing the face of a boy waving from a ship. The river remembers. Morning crept over Manhattan not with haste, but with reverence. The sun rose slowly, brushing its golden fingers across the surface of the river, waking it gently from its night slumber. Fog still clung to the banks, reluctant to let go of the stories it had overheard. Along the shore, a boy named Netak walked alone. Barefoot, he traced the path his ancestors had walked for centuries, where footprints had long been swallowed by tide and time. He was barely more than 12 winters old, but his eyes carried a depth uncommon for his years. Today he had come not to play, but to listen. His grandmother had told him, "The river speaks, but only if your heart is quiet." He knelt by the water's edge, placing both hands gently into its coolness. Tiny ripples formed, distorting his reflection, then smoothing again as if the river were deciding whether to speak back. The current was gentle that morning, yet it carried weight. He could feel it. The flow was not just of water, but of memory. Somewhere upstream, the sound of paddles broke the stillness. A small group of Dutch traders were moving downriver in their narrow boat, unaware of the sacredness of the water beneath them. Nidak did not run. He watched them with wide, silent eyes. The traders laughed among themselves, pointing at the trees, arguing in their coarse language. They saw only the forest, not the life within it. They saw the fish in the water, not the spirit of the river itself. They saw opportunity, not ancestry. When they passed, Nidak dipped a carved stone into the current. It was shaped like a turtle, his family's totem, and painted with ash and berry. He whispered a blessing in Lenape: "Let the river carry our memory, let it never forget us." And then he let it go. The turtle drifted, slow and sure, caught in the current's gentle pull. Years later, long after stone buildings would line this river, and names like Wall Street would replace the names his people gave, a child might find that turtle washed ashore, smooth and faded, but still sacred. For rivers do not forget. They remember everything. The gnawing of things. In the time before maps carved lines across the land, names were given not for ownership, but for reverence. The Lenape named what they loved, and in naming, they honored the soul of every place, every stream, every stone. On a cool morning, a council gathered in a sun-dappled clearing. The trees stood as sentinels, swaying gently above the circle of elders, women, and children. They had come to name a newly discovered spring, a silver thread weaving through the roots of ancient pines. An elder named Tamaqua, whose voice still carried the strength of many winters, stood at the center with a ceremonial shell rattle in hand. He turned slowly, letting the quiet of the forest settle around them. Then he knelt by the spring and dipped his fingers into its clear water. He tasted it, as was tradition, sweet, cold, alive. He spoke not in haste, but with the care of one who understood words held weight. "This spring runs with the spirit of the deer, swift, gentle, and nourishing. Let it be called Wellemalsen Sippo, the stream of kindness." A soft murmur passed through the gathering, approval not shouted but breathed. Children repeated the name under their breath as if it were a secret spell. Wellemalsen Sippo, the stream of kindness. In the days to follow, every time a Lenape walked past that spring, they did not pass a place. They greeted a presence. They knew its name and thus its nature. But over time others came, those who saw springs as water to be measured, forests as acres to be claimed, and names as things to be simplified or forgotten. Wellemalsen Sippo became a blank spot on a Dutch ledger, a parcel in a trade. Later still, it was buried beneath cobblestones. Yet Tamaq's naming had not been in vain, for even stones remember. And every so often, when rain falls hard and water rushes unexpectedly through the streets of Manhattan, there are those who pause at the sound of trickling in the gutters, wondering why it feels familiar. Somewhere beneath the concrete, the stream of kindness still runs. The firekeeper's vigil. As twilight deepened into the indigo hush of night, the Lenape village quieted. Children, curled beside mothers on woven mats, drifted into sleep beneath deerskin coverings. The rustle of wind among the trees softened. Yet one person remained fully awake, kneeling beside the heart of the longhouse, the eternal flame. She was the firekeeper, an elder woman named Winona, whose name meant firstborn daughter. Her hair, streaked with silver, fell loosely down her back. In her hands she held a carved wooden paddle, used to shift the embers and feed the fire that never died. Her duty was not merely to tend flame, it was to guard memory. Each night she whispered into the fire, names of ancestors, stories of births and deaths, songs that had not been sung aloud in years. The fire did not answer with words, but it listened, and its dancing light cast the silhouettes of old faces on the walls, faces only Winona still remembered. Tonight her voice was hoarse. She had seen signs, clouds moving backward against the wind, an owl calling thrice before dusk, omens of change. Still, she fed the fire, cradling it like a final ember of a world slowly slipping away. In Lenape belief, the fire was not just warmth or cooking, it was spirit. It was the bridge between the seen and unseen. Winona's vigil was both sacred and heartbreaking. She knew that in time, perhaps no one would remember the meaning of her chants, that the longhouse might stand empty, that the fire might be extinguished by a wind no one could stop. But tonight it lived, tonight it glowed, and she, the keeper of all things unspoken, would guard it until her last breath. Some say that centuries later, in moments when Manhattan's lights flickered during a storm, a warm wind sometimes slips through the alleyways, carrying with it the scent of burning cedar and the murmur of a voice not yet forgotten. Echoes in the stone. Beyond the forests and riverbanks of Mannahatta, there stood a ridge known to the Lenape as Sappakannikin, a place where the stones were said to speak if one listened long enough. It was not a village or a hunting ground, but a place of deep memory. Here, the earth had absorbed centuries of footsteps, ceremonies, and sorrow. The ridge overlooked the river where fish once shimmered in numbers so vast they turned the water silver. At dawn, a young Lenape boy named Tammet emerged from the trees, carrying only a bone flute and a pouch of offerings. He had been sent by the elders on a quiet rite of passage, not to slay or conquer, but to listen. His task was simple in appearance, yet profound, to hear the stories the land still held. Tammet sat among the moss-covered stones, placing tobacco leaves into the crevices as a gesture of gratitude. Then he waited. Hours passed. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead. The wind whispered through the birches. And then faintly something stirred. Not words, not voices, but memories, echoes. He felt them more than heard them. The stamp of deer hooves on damp ground, the heartbeat thump of drumming far away, the slow chant of morning songs lost to the colonizer's silence. Tammet's skin tingled as if the air itself pressed against him, inviting him into its hidden archive. Tears slid down his face without knowing why. It was not sadness alone, it was awe. The weight of generations rested in that place. The stones had not forgotten, neither should he. Later he would return to his village and speak of what he felt, though he could not describe it fully. And the elders would nod, knowing he had been accepted, not just by them but by the land itself. He was now a keeper of memory. In the centuries to come, the name Sappakannikin would vanish from maps, replaced by foreign titles. Streets and buildings would rise, but under concrete and steel, the stones would still hum softly, waiting for someone willing to listen. The Longhouse at dusk. As evening shadows stretched long across the clearing, the great longhouse of the Wolf clan stood bathed in the amber glow of dying sunlight. Its bark-covered exterior, weathered but proud, had witnessed generations of laughter, ceremony, and grief. Smoke drifted lazily from its central smoke hole, tracing old patterns in the sky as if whispering messages to the ancestors above. Inside, the air was warm and fragrant with cedar and sweetgrass. The longhouse was not merely a structure, it was a vessel of memory, a beating heart of Lenape life. Along its length, fire pits flickered, surrounded by mats and woven blankets where families gathered. Tools carved from bone and wood rested nearby, each one telling a story of use, care, and craftsmanship passed from parent to child. This night an elder named Quinatta sat at the central hearth, his weathered hands weaving a story into the hush. Children leaned forward, eyes wide. Even the adults sat quietly, for this tale was not for amusement, it was for remembrance. He spoke of the sky woman who fell through the clouds, of the turtle who rose to hold the earth on his back, and of the first forests that bloomed from her footsteps. His voice was low, reverent, steady, like the rhythm of a drumbeat echoing across centuries. And as he spoke, the flickering fire painted shadows on the walls, shadows that danced like spirits made of flame. Outside, night descended fully. Stars emerged over the trees, piercing the darkness like ancient eyes. The longhouse held its warmth like a womb, protecting the stories inside from the forgetting winds that blew ever harder from the east. Beyond the horizon, colonists cleared trees and staked claims, their languages loud and foreign. But inside the longhouse, a quieter power held. The Lenape remembered, the children listened, the ancestors stirred gently in the smoke. And Quinatta's story went on. The song of the morning dove. The forest had fallen into a hush. Beneath the towering canopy of Mannahatta, twilight had deepened into a velvet silence, pierced only by the plaintive cry of a morning dove. It came soft and slow, like a breath exhaled from the trees themselves, a song older than memory, older even than the trail that wound beneath the elder pines. Nakamis, a grandmother of the Turtle clan, paused in her gathering of kindling. Her ears caught the familiar call, and she bowed her head. That dove, she believed, carried messages between the worlds. Its sorrowful tune was not one of despair, but of remembrance. It was said that when the spirits of the departed could not find peace, they whispered to the dove, and the dove would sing until they were heard. She bent low to the ground, her fingers brushing the earth as gently as if stroking a sleeping child. "I hear you," she whispered into the gathering dark. "We have not forgotten." In the distance, smoke from cooking fires rose like thin ribbons through the canopy. Children's laughter had quieted, the community was settling for the night. Nakamis returned to the village slowly, her steps guided not just by path but by memory. Along the way she left small offerings, a bit of cornmeal at the base of a maple, a few berries beside a stone, and a hushed prayer by the river's bend. As she passed the resting place of her husband, marked only by a circle of stones and a smooth feather, she paused again. The dove's call lingered overhead. She closed her eyes. The forest remembered, the ancestors were near. And Nakamis, wrapped in her deerskin shawl, continued walking beneath the stars, her heart heavy with stories yet to be told. The fire circle and the teaching stones. Nightfall had draped its velvet cloak across Mannahatta, and with it came the ritual gathering. In the heart of the village, stones arranged in a perfect circle enclosed a central fire that burned low and steady, never too high, never untended. This was the fire circle, the place where memory and meaning were passed from one generation to the next. The young sat in silence, knees tucked under chins, eyes wide with anticipation. Before them stood Wulatnam, a respected elder of the Wolf clan. His skin was lined with years, his shoulders stooped from the weight of stories carried a lifetime. Around his neck hung a pouch of polished river stones, each one a lesson, each one a truth. They were known as the teaching stones. With reverence he reached into the pouch and selected one, dark and smooth, etched faintly with a spiral. He held it up, letting it catch the firelight, and the flickering glow danced across his face. This, he began, is the Stone of Origin. It speaks of the first dream, when the world was a great water, and Sky Woman fell from the heavens into its embrace. He placed the stone before the fire, and the children leaned closer, as if to warm themselves not only by heat but by wisdom. One by one, Wulatnam revealed the stones, each with its tale, the coming of the animals, the shaping of the island, the covenant of respect between humans and earth. Behind the fire, elders watched with knowing smiles, nodding at familiar cadences. The past was not lost, it was here, flickering in firelight, etched in stone, carried on breath. As the final stone was laid down, Wulatnam sat in stillness. A hush fell over the children. And then from the shadows a quiet voice rose, the youngest of them all, asking, "Will the stories end, grandfather?" He smiled, eyes glistening. "The stories only sleep, child, like stones they wait to be touched." The fire crackled in reply. Echoes beneath the bark. The forest was still, cloaked in the hush of early twilight, when young Tamakwa wandered beyond the cedar line. He was a boy of 10 winters, lithe and curious, with feet that moved like wind over moss. The elders said the land spoke if you listened rightly, and Tamakwa listened with the patience of roots. That evening he paused before a grand, ancient birch, its white bark veined with black, like old maps of forgotten trails. Something called to him, not with words but with a hum beneath the surface of the world. He placed his palm against the tree, closed his eyes, and listened. And there it was. A soft tremor, a breath, a memory. Long ago, beneath this very tree, his great-grandfather had carved a message, not in letters but in symbols, grooves that spoke of a time when the Lenape gathered here to mark the passing of the sun's spirits, to honor the turning of the seasons. The bark had grown over the marks in places but not erased them. The tree remembered. Tamakwa traced a finger along the faded lines, and images danced in his mind. Dancers in painted masks moving in slow rhythm, women offering bundles of sweetgrass, a circle of children being taught the names of stars. His breath slowed, and his heartbeat found the rhythm of the earth. Behind him, the wind moved gently through the leaves, not unlike an elder clearing his throat before speaking. The boy turned and whispered, "I hear you." And the forest for a moment breathed back. The circle of old voices. By the firelight of the central clearing, the elders gathered once more. It was a night of stories, not the ones told for children before sleep, but the deeper ones, the kind passed only when the moon was high and the earth most still. Tamakwa sat quietly among them, knees drawn to his chest, eyes wide and waiting. Beside him, old Mashuladabi, with skin like folded bark and eyes that saw through years, leaned forward and pressed a smoldering stick into the ash ring before him. "This is where memory lives," he said, voice like wind through dry leaves. "Not in the mouth, but in the fire, the air, the bones beneath us." One by one the elders spoke, not in haste or volume, but with the measured weight of those who understood silence was just as sacred. They spoke of the Lenape's first migrations, of the dreams that led their ancestors down rivers and through stone valleys, of the longhouse that once stood where the stars now glimmered between the treetops. Each tale folded into the next like braids in hair, separate, yet part of the same flow. They spoke of the first salmon caught, the first snow remembered, the first grief buried under the red maples by the water's edge. Tamakwa did not move. He understood, as children sometimes do in their quietness, that this was the path of shells. In the days that followed the Council of Stories, Tamakwa found himself drawn to the shoreline, where the forest thinned and the great water breathed against the sand. There in the morning stillness he would walk alone, tracing the line where waves kissed the land, his toes brushing scattered shells and driftwood that whispered of unseen currents. The elders called it Wihel, the place of tide offerings. To the Lenape, this was more than just a beach, it was a liminal space where the ancestors came to speak through the voice of the sea. The shells that washed ashore were not mere remnants, but messages, each spiraled whorl a symbol, each crack a fracture in the memory of the earth. That morning Tamak stooped to pick up a large quahog shell, its surface aged and marked with purples and cream. He remembered what grandmother once said as she sewed wampum: each bead is a word, each string a sentence, each belt a memory the land never forgets. Nearby, Teaka, a soft-spoken shellworker whose hands moved with sacred precision, was kneeling beside a stretch of smooth bark. On it she arranged shells by size and shade, forming a pattern only the trained eye could read. She looked up as Tamakwa approached. "Do you see the shape in this?" she asked, her voice barely louder than the sea breeze. "This belt speaks of peace offered, peace broken. The white is the calm, the purple is the sorrow." Tamakwa studied the arrangement, his young eyes beginning to understand the stories not spoken with mouths, but shaped by hands. Teaka touched his wrist gently. "The path of the Lenape is made of these shells, memories, choices. Each time we gather them, we choose again who we are." Behind them, the ocean kept its rhythm, offering up the ancient things for those with the will to listen. Not just storytelling, this was spell-weaving, a stitching of souls into the fabric of the land. At the end, Mashulatabi did not finish with a moral, but with a silence so full it felt like thunder without sound. Then he looked to the boy. "One day," he said, "you will carry a voice, make sure it remembers ours." And the fire cracked softly as if agreeing. The dance of the sacred fire. As twilight descended upon the Lenape village, the scent of burning sweetgrass drifted through the crisp air. Shadows lengthened between the longhouses, and the rhythmic beat of a hand drum echoed like a pulse from the heart of the earth. Tonight was not just any gathering, it was the night of the sacred fire, when the community would dance to honor Kishalemukong, the creator, and to remind the stars above that the people still remembered their place beneath them. In the center of the clearing, elders kindled a fire using flint and cedar bark, the flames licking upward as if remembering ancient songs. The logs were arranged in a spiral, symbolizing life's circular path, the past feeding the present birthing the future. Sparks rose like spirits taking flight, and around the fire, a wide circle formed. Tamakwa, dressed in deerskin and painted with ochre symbols on his cheeks, took his place beside his mother. She whispered softly, "Do not dance only with your feet, dance with your blood, your breath, and your bones. This fire remembers every step our people have taken." One by one, the dancers began to move. They stepped in time with the drum beat, swaying like saplings in wind, their arms outstretched to the sky. Each motion told a story: the first hunt, the planting of corn, the weeping of mothers during the great winter. Young and old, warrior and weaver, all became one. Teaka entered the ring last, her wampum beads shimmering in the firelight, her body flowing like a river in prayer. She carried no staff, no mask, only silence and grace. When she raised her hands to the moon above, the circle fell still. Even the trees seemed to lean in, listening. Then came a final drumbeat, thunderous and deep, and the fire flared one last time before settling into glowing embers. No words followed, only stillness and the knowing that something ancient had been awakened. Tamakwa turned his eyes skyward, where stars blinked through drifting smoke. In that flickering silence he felt it, that the spirits had come close again, not to speak, but to watch and remember. The silent forest. At the edge of the Lenape village, where the cleared land gave way to wild thickets and towering old-growth oaks, there lay a patch of forest that no child dared wander into alone. It was not fear that kept them out, it was reverence. This grove was not marked by any sign or fence, yet every Lenape soul knew its boundary. They called it Pim Wusink, the silent forest. Here the usual sounds of the land, chirping birds, chattering squirrels, even the wind in the leaves, grew faint, as though the air itself held its breath. It was said that this forest had once been the site of a sacred council between humans and spirits when the world was still being shaped. The trees here grew twisted in elegant, solemn forms, their roots coiling like old stories beneath the moss. Tamakwa stood at its edge for the first time, not as a child filled with tales, but as a young man ready to listen. He had been sent by the elders with no task but to wait, and that was enough. The sun filtered weakly through the foliage above, dappling his shoulders with light. The silence was not absence, it was presence, a deep, endless listening. He stepped carefully between the trunks, his moccasins brushing against fallen leaves that did not crunch. In the hush, every motion felt magnified. A leaf detaching from a branch drifted down like a feather carved from amber. A distant owl called once, low and slow, before falling quiet again. There was no vision, no thunder or voice from the sky, only stillness, and yet Tamaqua felt changed. The forest did not speak, but it remembered. Every Lenape who entered it came away with something unspoken, a sense of being witnessed, measured, accepted. He emerged at dusk, his brow damp, his heartbeat slowed. Teaka was waiting for him at the edge, sitting cross-legged beneath a cedar tree. She did not ask what he saw. Instead, she offered a drink from a woven pouch and whispered, "Now the forest knows your name." The river that remembers. The river wound through Mannahatta like a silver ribbon, its current slow but steady, always whispering, always carrying. The Lenape called it Mahakanatuk, the river that flows both ways, because of the tidal pull that sent its waters upstream and down. But the elders said it held deeper memory than that. It remembered every footprint on its banks, every canoe that had split its surface, every cry of joy, and every morning song sung beneath the moon. On this misty morning, Tamaqua paddled alone in a narrow birch canoe carved by his uncle. The waters shimmered in the dawn light, a soft gold rippling across the surface. He was not traveling to fish or hunt, he had come to listen. His paddle slipped through the water without sound, leaving only swirling eddies behind. Around him, the world was hushed but alive, the quiet splash of turtles dropping from sun-warmed logs, the distant cry of herons, the rustle of reeds in the gentle breeze. Every movement was a message. Tamaqua closed his eyes for a moment, letting the canoe drift. He recalled stories of the river's spirit, an old woman with long, flowing hair of silver, who could speak to those willing to wait in silence. She knew the past of all things because the river had seen it all. He opened his eyes and watched as a leaf floated alongside him, spinning slowly. In its path he saw not just the water, but images, brief, flickering memories, a Lenape boy chasing his dog across the shallows, a woman lighting a floating offering by firelight, a warrior returning, bloodied but alive. The river held their moments, not in words, but in motion, in reflection, in the pulse of its flow. Tamaqua reached into the water, cupping a handful and letting it fall back through his fingers. "You remember them," he whispered. "Will you remember me?" There was no reply, only the steady rhythm of the tide, like a breath older than the world. But as he turned his canoe back toward shore, he felt the river cradling him gently, as if to say, "I already do." The song of birch and flame. Long before the settlers came with their muskets and prayers, long before the Dutch ships carved the horizon, there was only the forest, and in that forest the birch tree was sacred. To the Lenape, birch was not just wood, it was skin, vessel, and spirit. They called it Widatoakan, the white bark that gave itself to the people. From it they shaped canoes that skimmed the rivers like whispers, built shelters that breathed with the seasons, and wrapped the dead before their journey to the next world. On this evening, young Wulamo and his grandmother, known among the people as Grandmother Flame, sat beside a fire just beyond the tree line. The sky blazed orange behind the trees, and the air smelled of pine smoke and moss. Wulamo held a strip of birch bark, turning it over in his hands with care. His grandmother's voice rose into the dusk, low and melodic, singing a song older than memory. "This song," she said between verses, "is not mine. It came from the flame, from the bark as it curled and cracked in fire. It sings when you listen." Wulamo watched the fire. Within its flickers, shapes danced, branches becoming beasts, flame turning into figures of dancers and warriors, of deer leaping through shadow. He saw his grandfather's silhouette in the fire, hands carving a canoe. He saw his own birth, or the memory of it, cradled by red light. "When our people are forgotten," Grandmother Flame said softly, "the birch will remember. And when the birch is gone, the song will drift, looking for ears that still hear." The wind shifted, the fire popped and hissed as the birch bark caught flame. It twisted and curled like fingers folding into a fist, releasing smoke into the starlit air. Wulamo breathed in, and for a moment he heard it, a note inside the crackle, a melody among embers. And he knew then that songs were not taught but found, hidden in bark and flame, in river and stone, waiting for a heart still quiet enough to listen. The star map of the ancestors. Night had fallen upon Mannahatta, and the forest whispered in stillness. The moon, half veiled by drifting clouds, cast a silver sheen upon the wide clearing near the river's bend. Here, beneath an ancient elm whose branches had cradled generations, the Lenape gathered for a sacred rite that reached further back than spoken history. The young, the old, the in-between, all came to witness the reading of the stars. At the heart of the gathering stood an elder named Tawiskara, a man with hair like winter moss and eyes deep as river stones. He carried no staff, no drum, only a smooth stone etched with symbols, passed from elder to elder since the days when the great turtles still swam the southern shores. "Long before our feet touched this earth," he said, raising his hand to the sky, "our spirits walked these stars." He motioned upward. Above them the canopy of the heavens opened. constellations gleaming in clarity only the old world nights could offer. The big bear, the river serpent, the cedar eye, they all swam above in silent motion. Tawiskara knelt and began to draw into the earth, tracing lines with his fingers, connecting stars with grooves in the soil. Around him, the tribe formed a circle, their eyes following each mark with reverent attention. This was not just a ritual of navigation, it was memory, preserved not in books but in breath and dust. Our ancestors knew the sky as you know the river, he continued. Each light a spirit, each path a journey begun long before you were born. The stars tell us when to plant, when to hunt, when to mourn, and when to sing. They are our calendar, our compass, our kin. He pointed to a formation glowing in the east. This, he whispered, is the path of return. When our time here ends, our spirits follow it home. Around the fire, a hush settled over the gathering, not sorrowful but solemn, the kind of silence that comes when a people remember who they are. Wulamo looked up, his young face aglow in starlight. For the first time he felt the weight of belonging, not to the soil alone, but to a map stretched above him, eternal and enduring. The Keeper of Stories. In a quiet alcove nestled between mossy boulders and whispering cedars, an old woman named Maxkawaya sat cross-legged on a woven mat. She was known not for hunting, nor for planting, nor for singing, but for remembering. The children gathered around her like bees to a lantern, wide-eyed and barefoot, eager for what they called the golden thread, the stories that stitched their world together. She did not raise her voice, she didn't need to. Her tone was gentle but strong, like a stream cutting through stone. In her hands she held a bundle of bark scrolls, each carefully marked with symbols only the elders could read. The ink was made of boiled roots and ash, pressed by careful hands over years of ritual practice. There was a time, she began, when the great heron flew so high above Mannahatta that her wings could shade the river. And with that, the children lined in closer. She told of spirits that lived in pine trees, of how each shadow cast at twilight was not emptiness but presence. She spoke of a time before language had shape, when stories were sung into the wind and learned by listening, not speaking. In her story, the people were not at the center, but a part of the larger circle, no greater than the fox or the willow or the moonlight that filtered through the canopy. One child, a quiet girl named Lene, asked softly, "Do the stories remember us when we forget them?" Maxkawaya smiled, her eyes glinting with the soft shine of many years. "The stories wait," she whispered. "They do not vanish, they sleep, and when you are ready, they wake." The children said nothing more. They simply listened as the air grew still, and the fireflies blinked like drifting punctuation in the forest dusk. In that moment, the forest was not just a place, it was a page, and every breeze that passed through the leaves was another word in the tale of the Lenape. The burial path. As the sun set behind the jagged hills to the west, the people of the village gathered in silence along a narrow path that wound through the ancient woods. This was not a time of mourning, though they carried the body of their elder with care. It was a return. Wrapped in a mantle of woven deerhide and adorned with a single eagle feather, the body lay atop a wooden litter carried by 4 men, 2 sons, a nephew, and a lifelong friend. Behind them came the rest, walking slowly, their heads lowered, each carrying a small offering, shells, berries, feathers, or smooth river stones etched with symbols of thanks. The path was old, so old that the trees leaned away from it, as though recognizing the sacredness of what passed beneath them. It was said the spirits walked this path too, unseen and barefoot, brushing gently against those who walked with reverence. Women hummed a melody passed down through centuries, its notes rising and falling like wind over tall grass. There were no drums, only breath, steps, and song. When they reached the chosen site, a gentle hill facing the river, they formed a circle around a narrow pit lined with pine boughs and river clay. One by one, each villager stepped forward to whisper a final word, placing their gift gently upon the body. No one hurried, time had no claim here. A small fire burned beside the grave, its smoke curling upward like the soul's final breath. The shaman lifted a carved pipe and offered a single puff to the 4 winds before sealing it back in its hide pouch. Then the earth was closed. But before they turned away, the eldest among them spoke. "From the ground we rise, to the ground we return, but the name walks on with the wind." As night fell, the stars blinked to life, first one, then dozens, then hundreds, and beneath them the village walked home in silence, guided by memory. The spirit tree. Not far from the village, hidden beyond a thick curtain of wild vines and moss-draped branches, stood a tree unlike any other. The Lenape called it Ashkekwan, the spirit tree. It was not the tallest, nor the broadest, but it was the oldest. Elders claimed it had stood since the time the stars first learned their names. Its bark was silvered with age, marked by hundreds of carvings, spirals, arrows, stars, animals, faces, and words in the sacred syllables of the people. No one carved without cause. Each mark was a memory, a plea, a thanks, a warning. When a child was born, their family etched a symbol. When one passed on, another symbol joined. In this way, the tree carried the lives of many. One morning each moon cycle, the oldest living woman of the village came to wash the roots with water from the sacred spring. She whispered stories to it, old stories, full of laughter, sorrow, trickery, and truth. It was said the tree remembered them all. Birds never nested in its branches, but they circled above it, singing at dawn and dusk as though drawn by an unseen promise. The air beneath its canopy was always still, no matter the wind outside, and when someone pressed their forehead to its trunk, they claimed to hear echoes, voices layered in time, sometimes in sorrow, sometimes in joy. To the Lenape, Oshkoquan was not a relic, it was a living witness, and every offering laid at its roots was not merely a gift but a continuation, a thread woven into the soul of the land. Offerings to the wind. At the highest ridge above the Lenape village, where the trees thinned and the stone rose bare from the earth, there stood a wind altar, a circle of standing stones crowned with moss and smoothed by generations of hands. It was a sacred place, not built by command, but slowly, reverently shaped by those who understood that the wind was not merely weather, but a messenger between the worlds. The people came here when the sky turned restless or when questions weighed heavily on the soul. They brought offerings, not gold or jewels, but humble things made with care. A carved feather, a lock of hair bound with grass, a song painted onto bark with berry dye. Each item was held aloft in silence and then placed on the flat stone at the altar's heart, where the wind could lift it, if it chose to. Sometimes the wind came suddenly, fierce and wild, sweeping the offering away into the forest. At other times it barely stirred, as if waiting for a better gift or a truer heart. The Lenape believed the wind knew what could not be spoken, and that no lie could pass through it. On one autumn day, a young boy brought a painted shell to the altar. He said nothing, only stood still as the wind circled him, tousling his hair like a father's hand. Then it lifted the shell with a single breath and carried it far beyond sight. The elders, watching from a distance, nodded silently. The boy had been heard. The wind altar did not promise answers, but it promised that the question would be carried, beyond the hills, beyond the rivers, into the unseen places where ancestors walked with the earth. The smoke that speaks. In the heart of every Lenape longhouse, rising above the fire pit and passing through the opening in the roof, was the smoke, never silent, never still. It curled and coiled, whispered and wandered, speaking in a language only the old ones truly understood. The Lenape believed smoke carried prayers, memories, and the spirits of words into the sky. Elders taught the young to read its movement. The quick twist meant impatience from the ancestors, the steady rise showed acceptance. During gatherings, they burned sweetgrass and white sage, the smell curling through the beams like forgotten lullabies. These sacred plants were not burned for fragrance but as conduits, gifts to the unseen. Women would hum while preparing the bundles, wrapping them tightly with dyed threads made from plant fibers. Each thread had meaning, red for courage, yellow for clarity, blue for morning. Before sunrise, the bundle was placed in the fire and all fell silent as the smoke rose. On one winter night, a young woman who had lost her brother sat alone before the embers. She lit a braid of sweetgrass and watched the smoke rise slowly, then sharply twist toward the north. Her breath caught that direction. The north was where her brother had fallen months before. The smoke knew. She did not cry. Instead, she nodded and whispered his name, letting it drift upward, letting it be carried. Smoke, the Lenape believed, was not just the result of fire. It was memory taking form, breath becoming sky. It was the voice of the in-between. Ceremonies by the moonlight. When the moon was round and silver, casting her watchful glow across the forests of Mannahatta, the Lenape gathered in reverence beneath her light. The full moon marked not just the passage of time but the rhythm of the spirit. The elders called it Luna's drum, for they believed its pull echoed in their blood and in the flow of rivers, guiding the rituals of birth, planting, hunting, and death. Children, once forbidden from joining, were now allowed to attend in silence, wrapped in blankets made of animal hides and stitched with quills. Around a central stone ring, elders arranged offerings, acorns, deer bone beads, feathers dyed with ochre and crushed berries. A low chant began, more breath than melody, vibrating in the air like the hush before snowfall. Women in copper and gold-toned garments began the moon dance, a slow, circular motion mirroring the shape of the sky above. Their feet hardly made a sound, yet their movement stirred the leaves on the ground and awakened something old in the earth. Every motion was intentional, every turn a remembrance. The fire in the center burned low, more embers than flame, casting long shadows that danced in tandem with the women. One elder stood apart, holding a carved staff crowned with a crescent of deer antler. He watched the youngest girl take her first steps into the circle, her face painted with a fine line of white clay across her brow. And when the owl hooted thrice in the distance, everyone paused. The moment had come. It was time to speak the names of those who had gone before, to call them back, not in sorrow, but in respect. The language of beads and smoke. Before the written word there were beads strung with meaning, laced with memory. Among the Lenape, a single strand of wampum could speak more than a dozen mouths. These sacred belts were not jewelry, but vessels of language, bound by the patient hands of women and the weight of solemn truth. Each color bore a message: white for peace, purple for warning, black for sorrow, red for life. Inside a smoke lodge one crisp morning, a young boy knelt before his grandmother. Before him lay strands of shell beads, polished from river clams, strung in complex patterns across deer sinew. The smoke curled from a small sacred fire beside them, carrying with it herbs, sweetgrass and cedar, meant to cleanse the space and the soul. She taught him without speaking. Her fingers moved, deliberate, slow. One white bead, two purple, paused. The boy watched, then mimicked. When he placed the beads in reverse, she tapped the sinew gently, not as scolding, but reminder. Language, she had told him once, is not just sound, it is rhythm, it is order, it is silence between the beads. The finished belt would one day be carried to another village. There it would be laid across the ground, not spoken but understood, its patterns echoing memory and promise. In these threads they recorded births, alliances, treaties, and griefs. To dishonor a belt was to unravel a truth that could not be rewoven. Outside, the morning light filtered through pine boughs, thin and golden. But within the lodge, the smoke and beads spoke their own light. Guardians of the shell mounds. Long before cobblestones and sewers, Mannahatta's shores were lined with towering shell mounds, testaments to countless generations of meals, ceremonies, and communal life. These shell middens, white and sun-bleached, were more than garbage heaps. They were the guardians of time, formed by the slow, sacred layering of memory, each clam and oyster shell a marker of gathering, of family, of ritual. The Lenape elders would point to them as if to a scroll. This, they'd say, is where the spring dances began, or here is where my father sang into the sea. They did not need calendars. The mounds held their seasons, their silences, and their songs. One such mound near the mouth of a now-forgotten stream had grown taller than a man. On its summit, children would sit at dusk and press their ears to the warm shells, claiming they could hear voices whispering, echoes of old council fires, or the laughter of fishermen long gone. But these sacred heaps were not eternal. With the coming of settlers, the shells were carted away, ground for lime, crushed for roadbed. The voices faded, buried beneath foreign stone. The children no longer climbed the heaps, for the heaps no longer stood. And yet in some corners of the mind, the scent of brine and crushed shell still lingers. Memory, like a shell, endures when it is held with care. The fire circle's last light. As night descended over the forests of Mannahatta, the Lenape would gather in a wide clearing marked by fire-blackened stones, smooth, ancient, arranged in a circle worn by time. It was here that the fire circles came to life. Flames leapt skyward, casting stories across the bark of surrounding trees. The old ones spoke, and the young listened, not merely with ears but with the heart. Around the flames, shadows danced. Faces shimmered with warmth and knowing. Every spark that rose was a thread in the tapestry of memory, each ember an echo of someone long remembered. The fire was not just heat or light, it was history igniting the night again and again. In these final days before the world would shift, the fire circle became more sacred still. The elders told stories with a trembling urgency of the trickster spirit, of the great turtle who carried the land, of how the stars once spoke. Their voices cracked like dry leaves, and silence fell heavy after each tale, as if the trees themselves bowed in reverence. One last night, it is said, the flames refused to catch. The wood was dry, the kindling ready, but the fire, like a soul departing, would not stay. The Lenape knew then. The time of unbroken circles had come to an end. Still beneath city streets and hidden roots the stones remain, cold now, but they remember. Offerings to the river. At dawn, before the sun crested the hills of Mannahatta, the Lenape would walk barefoot to the river's edge. Women carried woven baskets of food, feathers, and beads. Men brought carved figures and bundles of herbs. Children, silent with reverence, followed in small clusters, cradling smooth stones wrapped in bark. These were not mere rituals, they were conversations with the land and water, an agreement between earth and spirit. The East River was not only a path to the ocean, but a living being, an ancient listener. The Lenape did not take from it without giving back, so offerings were made not as payment but as kinship. The morning air shimmered, light catching on ripples like moving gold. A figure cloaked in deerskin stood in the shallows and sang a song in a language born before time. The others knelt. Objects were gently placed into the water, each with a whispered name or wish: a carved turtle, a pouch of dried berries, a single white feather. All of it drifted outward on the tide, carried into the wide mouth of the world. When the ceremony ended, they did not speak. The river had heard them. The silence of the stones. Among the Lenape there were stones that spoke, though not in words. These stones, smooth and worn by generations of river and rain, were placed at the thresholds of longhouses and at the heart of ceremonial grounds. They were not idols, but keepers, memory dwellers. Elders taught the young that these stones had once lived beneath the feet of their ancestors, carried from village to village, as if gathering the silence of each journey. Some believed the spirits of the departed found rest within them, rest not as slumber but as presence. You could sit by one for hours and feel an old warmth rise through your legs into your chest, a grief that wasn't yours, a peace that wasn't asked for. On moonless nights when the fire was low and no drums sounded, a few would gather in a circle around a single stone and share dreams. They would not speak them aloud, only listen to the silence between breaths, for in that stillness, it was said, the stone might murmur back, not as voice but as understanding. To be heard by something that has endured so long was to remember who you were before names were spoken. When the river paused. There was a tale among the Lenape about a day when the river stopped flowing, not dried, not frozen, simply paused. The water lay still as glass, mirroring the sky so perfectly that birds, mistaking it for the open air, flew into its surface with soft, puzzled thuds. No one remembered exactly when this happened, only that it occurred once, and only once during the lifetime of a revered healer named Owains. She was old by then, her hair long and silver, her hands shaped by years of grinding, stirring, and stitching the wounds of both body and spirit. That morning the village stood silent at the edge of the river. Children reached for pebbles but did not throw. Even the trees seemed to lean inward, listening. Owain stepped barefoot into the water, her reflection not following her but waiting behind. She knelt at the heart of the stillness and whispered something no one else could hear. The ripples that followed did not move outward but inward, gathering toward her like a breath being taken, and just as quickly as it had stilled, the river began again. The elders said the river paused only to remember her, that the land, for a fleeting moment, acknowledged the quiet power of a woman who had never asked for anything but to mend. The night of 8 drums. It was said that on the longest night of winter, 8 drums once spoke as one. The elders gathered near the great fire in the central circle of the village, their silhouettes flickering against the bark walls of the longhouse. Snow thickened in the dark woods beyond, but inside the warmth was ancient and alive. The youngest children sat wide-eyed, their breath caught between stories and sleep. One by one, the drums were brought out, not beaten yet, but held as sacred bodies. Each had a name inherited from trees and beasts and sky. The first was carved from a lightning-struck ash, the second stretched with the skin of a mountain lion, the third tuned to the wind that blew through the island's hollows. When the 8th drum was placed before the fire, the oldest singer, whose voice was rarely heard, stood without speaking. He touched each drum with a bundle of feathers, then raised both arms. And then, not with hands but with memory, the drums began to sound. Not noise, not thunder, just a rhythm deeper than breath, woven from the island itself. The people closed their eyes, and in that moment they dreamed the same dream: a deer running through stars, a child walking backward into the future, a fire that spoke in a voice like water. When dawn came, no one spoke of what they saw, but the children, who had been smallest, began to hum the rhythm days later, and the snow melted early that year. When the moon stood still. In the quiet years before the foreign ships returned, there was a night when the moon refused to move. That's what the old storytellers said. It happened in late autumn, just before the last harvest. The Lenape had gathered for a nomming ceremony, a sacred tradition where a child, upon reaching their 7th leaf fall, would receive a name whispered by dreams and decided by the clan mother. That night all eyes turned to the eastern sky as the ceremony began, but the moon, bright and full, remained fixed, unmoving, like an eye that would not blink. The people stood in silence. The nomming halted. Children clutched their mothers' cloaks, unsure if it was a blessing or an omen. No breeze stirred, no owl called. Even the flames in the stone-lined fire pit flickered without smoke. An elder who had not spoken in years rose. He said in a voice as rough as dry bark, "The moon is listening." So the people sat and spoke not to each other, but to the moon. They told it of the names they hoped to give, of the ancestors they honored, of the river's song and the forest's sorrow. The moon listened, still and silver. Only when the final voice had quieted, only when the last name was spoken in hope and reverence, did the moon begin to drift again, slowly, as if carrying their words across the sky. That child's name became Silent Moon, and in later years she too became one who listened before speaking. The first footprints. Before there were paths, there were stories etched into the soil by bare feet. The Lenape believed the land remembered where they walked. Each step pressed into the earth was not simply travel, but testimony. They said the ground beneath Mannahatta was alive, listening, learning from each movement. The first footprints were not those of men, but of spirit beings, shapeshifters from the sky, who danced upon the island long before human memory. Children were told to walk with care in the woods, not merely for safety, but to honor the invisible trails left by these ancient ones. Every ridge, every sunken trail in the leaves was a word in a long, unspoken sentence. Elders would touch the mossy roots and say, "Here the hunter found forgiveness," or "Here the woman turned from sorrow." Over time, these invisible trails became communal memory. The great trail to the west began as a deer path, widened by generations of moccasins and stories. Along its winding turns, sacred stones marked crossings, each one inscribed not with symbols but with presence. One particular stone, shaped like a sleeping dog, was said to hum when approached with reverence. Not everyone could hear it, only those who walked with remembrance in their stride. The fire circle. At the heart of each Lenape village was a fire that never fully slept. This was not merely flame, it was memory, ceremony, connection. The fire circle was always tended day and night by the most trusted among them, often elders or widowed women who had seen much and carried the silence of their years with dignity. Around this flame, decisions were made not with haste or clamor, but with quiet turns of thought. The council sat in a circle, each voice like a stick laid carefully upon the fire. No one was above the flame, and no word was spoken without weight. The fire listened longer than any man could speak. Children learned early not to shout across the fire. Even laughter, though welcome, was gentled near its glow. It was told that smoke carried words into the sky, and angry voices would confuse the stars. At night the flames cast long shadows against the bark walls of the longhouse, where stories danced in flickering movement. Here legends lived again, the stone that wept, the turtle that carried the world, the eagle that remembered every song ever sung. To sit by that fire was not just warmth, it was to be part of something old, enduring, a light passed from hand to hand through centuries of dark and dawn. When the animals spoke. Long before the first canoe kissed the shore of Mannahatta, the Lenape believed the world was born in the breath of animals. They told of a time when beasts and birds spoke not just in gesture or sound, but in the language of the spirit, when the bear gave wisdom and the fox warned of storms. Children were taught these tales not as fairy stories, but as history shaped in paw and feather. The turtle was the first to offer its back to form the land, the beaver, the first to carve rivers into the earth. The great eagle flew highest, watching for imbalance, signaling danger with its cry. And in the hush between day and night, it was said you could still hear the deer whisper to the trees. These beliefs weren't mere myth, they were a way of listening, a way of walking with care, recognizing that the forest did not belong to man, but was shared among all who drew breath. Hunters gave thanks to the spirit of the deer before drawing the bowstring. Feathers were worn not for vanity, but as echoes of honored dialogue. To forget the speech of animals was to forget the beginnings of the world. As settlers later scoffed at such reverence, the stories faded from the open air. But for those who remembered, a rustle in the underbrush or a sudden cry in the night still carried a voice worth hearing. Offerings to the winds. The Lenape did not speak of weather as something apart from them. It was a living force, a spirit that breathed and listened. Winds were not simply air, they were elders of direction, emotion, and change. In quiet groves and along windswept cliffs, offerings were left, carved feathers tied with sinew, woven bundles of herbs, or even small carved stones kissed with breath and prayer. Each one was a message, a gesture of harmony toward the invisible powers that circled the world. The north wind was a stern guide, cold, relentless keeper of silence and judgment. The south wind carried laughter and abundance. The west wind was dreamlike, the gatekeeper to the other world. And the east wind, rising with the sun, brought birth and clarity. When storms churned over Mannahatta, the elders would gather the young and speak to the air, whispering gratitude or seeking forgiveness. For they believed that every gust carried memory, and every breeze could return as blessing or warning. Even the placement of a hut or the clearing of a path considered the voices of the winds. To ignore them was not only foolish, it was disrespect. For the winds, like ancestors, had long memories. And so, when the settlers arrived with axes and stone, cutting without ceremony, the Lenape knew the winds would not forget. Not because they were vengeful, but because they were keepers of balance, and balance, once broken, demanded to be restored. The sound beneath the leaves. In the hush of twilight, when the wind softened and the fires dimmed, the forest of Mannahatta came alive in a different way. Not with noise or motion, but with a rhythm, the deep, patient heartbeat of the land. The Lenape elders taught the young ones how to listen, not with ears alone, but with the whole body. They would sit in silence for hours, backs against tree trunks, hands pressed to the ground, eyes half closed, and in that stillness they would hear what others could not. The sound beneath the leaves was not just the scurrying of animals or the falling of branches. It was the pulse of old roots speaking to one another, the echo of footsteps long vanished, and the memory of songs sung before words were written. Children were told that if they listened well enough, they could hear the earth remember. It might tell them where water ran beneath stone, or where the deer would travel before dusk, but only if they were humble, and only if they were still. This way of knowing the world was sacred. It was not something to be taken. It had to be earned through patience, through presence, and through respect, for the forest did not speak to the hurried or the arrogant. It whispered only to those who knew how to wait. In those moments of listening, the Lenape understood they were never alone. Every leaf carried breath, every tree a name, every path a story, and as long as they listened, the land would remember them too. The last council fire. The final council fire of the Lenape burned slowly beneath the skeletal branches of late autumn. Its glow flickered on the solemn faces of the elders, casting long shadows on the sacred stones. Around the flame sat the last keepers of memory, wrapped in woven blankets dyed with crushed berries and earth, symbols of a world fading into ash and wind. One by one the elders rose and spoke not in sorrow, but in strength. They recited the names of rivers, trees, and ancestors. They spoke of treaties broken and forests felled, but also of deer trails remembered and ceremonies held in secret when watchers were gone. Their voices, though quiet, did not tremble. They burned with the same heat as the embers between them. The council was not a goodbye, it was a covenant, a final weaving of wisdom passed to the few who remained, the few who would carry stories in blood and bone, even if no one else would listen. The fire was tended until the last spark fell into darkness, and still they remained seated, surrounded by the silence of all that had been. Above them, stars pierced through thinning clouds like the eyes of ancestors watching, unblinking. And in that celestial silence, the Lenape whispered a promise to the land that had raised them. We were here. We are still here. And through the trees, the river, and the wind, you will remember us.